The Wild West is often romanticized in popular culture as a land of brave pioneers, gunfights, and outlaws. However, for the average person living in the West during the late 1800s, survival was a daily battle against a harsh and unforgiving environment. The dangers that plagued those who dared to carve out a life in this rugged land were not only physical, but also deeply psychological. If you don't have access to a well or a nearby stream, you could be faced with a long and treacherous journey just to fetch it. In many places, clean water was a scarce commodity, and it could be weeks between rainfall. The water you drink might be contaminated with bacteria or disease, and without the modern understanding of sanitation, this often led to illnesses like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid diseases that were deadly and could sweep through small frontier towns with frightening speed. Without the comforts of modern air conditioning, the heat becomes a constant battle. The dust in the air makes breathing difficult, and the dryness of the land means that even the simplest tasks, like carrying water or tending to livestock, leave you drenched in sweat. The lack of shade in the open plains means that you're re-exposed to the sun for hours, making it easy to succumb to heat stroke or dehydration. Even with a wide-brimmed hat and protective clothing, the heat is relentless, and there is little respite from its intensity. While many tribes were peaceful, others, particularly those who had been forced off their land by settlers, resorted to violence in a desperate attempt to defend their territories. You'll need to tend to the animals, make sure the campfire is still going, and check for any signs of danger, whether from animals, outlaws, or other settlers. Even after the day's work is done, you're always on edge, knowing that another survival challenge awaits the next day. In regions where tribal conflicts were common, settlers often found themselves in constant danger, whether from ambushes or outright attacks on their homes. From the scorching heat of summer to the relentless cold of winter, life in the Wild West was anything but glamorous. The Wild West is often portrayed as a place where gunfights were common, but it wasn't just outlaws and cowboys who caused trouble. Disputes over land, water rights, and property were a constant source of tension. A small argument could escalate into a deadly altercation, and with the lack of law enforcement in many areas, you were left to protect yourself. Gunfights were often not between well-known outlaws, but rather between ordinary men defending their rights, or simply trying to survive in a lawless land. Imagine waking up on a typical morning in the Wild West. The theft of cattle was common, and people were quick to resort to violence to defend their herds, and your only companionship would be the few others in your small town or trading posts. The loneliness of frontier life was palpable, and it could drive people to desperation. Mental health was rarely addressed, and the physical isolation contributed to a sense of hopelessness for many. The mental strain of constant vigilance, fear of attack, and the uncertainty of the future wore down even the toughest individuals. With no formal law enforcement to speak of, individuals had to rely on their own weapons and wits to protect themselves from theft, attack, and even murder. It's still dark outside, and the air is chilly, but within an hour, the sun will rise to reveal blistering heat that will make the world feel like a giant oven. You're in a soddy or a log cabin, likely miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by barren plains or dense forests that conceal their dangers. Once you've secured your morning water, you're faced with the task of food. The land was filled with wild animals, from bears and mountain lions to rattlesnakes and wolves. The bears in particular could be unpredictable and deadly. They roamed vast expanses of wilderness, looking for food, and if they found you or your livestock, the consequences could be devastating. Despite the dangers of hunting, it was often the only way to get meat for your family. Deer and antelope were plentiful in some areas, but hunting required skill, patience, and a great deal of luck. For many settlers, meals consisted of whatever could be hunted, foraged, or there was no refrigerator or preserved food to rely on. If you weren't fortunate enough to be near a fishing stream or a rich hunting ground, you might go days without a proper meal, surviving on cornmeal, beans, and whatever else you could grow or trade for. First thing in the morning, the most important task on your mind is water. But water scarcity was just one of the challenges of the day. Hunting for game, especially in the more remote areas, was not just about gathering food. It was a dangerous endeavor. As the day wears on and you return from hunting or fetching water, the sun's heat becomes unbearable. In addition to the physical toll, there's the ever-present threat of violence. These conflicts weren't always dramatic shootouts. More often, they took the form of disputes that grew into brawls or, worse, deadly skirmishes over small offenses. Social isolation also added a psychological toll. Living in remote homesteads meant that you might go days or weeks without seeing another soul. In addition to daily survival, you would have to contend with external threats, such as the looming possibility of Native American raids or attacks from hostile tribes. As the sun sets and the cool night air brings some relief, there's still no time for rest. In the Wild West, survival wasn't just a matter of bravery or fighting back. It was about endurance, about facing each day with the knowledge that danger was never far away, and yet continuing to push forward. As you step into the second half of your day in the Wild West, the physical toll from the relentless heat, dust, and dangers begins to accumulate. The early morning tasks fetching water, hunting, and checking on your livestock have already consumed much of your energy, but there is still so much to do. The sun is now at its highest, casting a punishing heat across the landscape, and you are forced to adapt or risk succumbing to exhaustion. After having secured some food, it's time to take care of your animals, which are crucial not only for food, but also for survival. Instead, it's often chaotic, with people firing wildly, sometimes hitting innocent bystanders. Outlaws and desperate men roaming the towns are quick to turn a minor disagreement into a violent encounter, and with no medical care or treatment, even the most superficial injury could prove fatal. With few resources nearby, you rely on what you can find in the area. But cutting wood isn't just about the labor of hauling logs. It's about safety. As you work in the wilderness, you could easily find yourself face to face with a rattlesnake or scorpion, to creatures whose venom can be fatal within hours if untreated. While wild predators like mountain lions are a known threat, the darkness makes them even more dangerous. In some regions, Native American tribes, many of whom had been displaced by settlers, fought to reclaim their land. You know that tomorrow you'll rise again to face the same challenges, be it battling the elements, surviving a predator attack, or defending your life against a rogue settler or outlaw. These raids, although not the constant conflict of popular mythology, were still real and dangerous. Survival often meant preparing for the worst, making sure your weapons are within reach, securing your doors and windows, and keeping a vigilant watch. The sound of hooves, the snarls of wolves, or the rustling in the bushes could signal that an attack is imminent. The creatures that roam at night are hunting for food, and your livestock, which you fought so hard to protect, could easily be taken by a pack of wolves or a hungry bear. What you did during the day was just as important as what you didn't do. Mistakes, even small ones, could cost you your life. Could the everyday person of the time truly endure all the elements, human threats, and constant battles for survival in a world that was so unforgiving? If you're too far from shelter, the chances of surviving a wild animal attack are slim. A bullet wound, especially without proper care, or even an antiseptic, could easily become infected, leaving you at the mercy of diseases like gangrene, which could lead to amputation or death within days. As with many dangers in the Wild West, there's no quick remedy. You can only hope the bite isn't fatal, and that you can survive long enough to reach help, which could be miles away. For most, a snake bite means death or long-term disability of fate that many faced in the Wild West, where medical care was limited and survival rates were far lower than in more developed regions. Without proper antibiotics, a cut from a knife or an animal bite could be enough to doom you. However, even here, the danger continues to lurk. The cold nights of the Wild West, especially in regions like the Rocky Mountains or the desert, can be just as life-threatening as the heat of the day. Nighttime temperatures can plummet, and if you haven't prepared properly, whether by building a fire or insulating your cabin, you could face a dangerous night of exposure. Frostbite is a real threat, especially in areas where the wind can sweep across the open plains, leaving you with little protection against the chill. Even those who carry guns to defend themselves often face accidental injuries or misfires in moments of panic. Whether you're tending to cattle, horses, or sheep, they all require constant attention. During this time, predators, especially wolves and mountain lions, are a constant threat. You've learned over time that keeping watch is an essential part of your role as a settler. If a predator gets too close, it could decimate your herd in minutes, a loss that would mean hunger for your family. But it's not just animals you need to watch out for. The threats of human violence continue to loom large in the Wild West. A simple trip into the nearest town can turn dangerous at any moment. Saloon brawls and altercations are daily occurrences. A disagreement at the bar, a disputed card game, or even a misunderstanding over a woman could escalate into a deadly conflict. The lack of law enforcement means that personal disputes can spill over into the streets, and shootouts are a frequent outcome. In many cases, the gunfight is not the cinematic, heroic battle of quick draws that many imagine. For the average person, getting involved in one of these shootouts could easily lead to death. During the afternoon, after surviving the heat and ensuring your herd is secure, there's the constant chore of gathering firewood, especially if you're living far from a town. The risk of snake bites is constant, and their bite is rarely noticed until the venom spreads throughout the body, often resulting in swelling, fever, and death. As the day wears on and the temperature starts to drop, you might be able to take some time to rest and prepare your shelter for the night. Another issue you have to consider as the night falls is the risk of animal attacks. On top of all this, you must still contend with the looming threats of outlaws and raids. As night falls, exhaustion sets in. Even when you finally settle into what little comfort you can manage in your bedroll or rudimentary bed, the danger is far from over. In the Wild West, survival didn't just depend on bravery or fighting skills, it resourcefulness and the ability to cope with an unrelenting and unpredictable environment. The question remains, with such constant danger surrounding you, how long would you truly survive in the Wild West? As the night in the Wild West settles in, bringing some relief from the scorching heat of the day, the dangers of survival are far from over. The wild animals that stalk the area during the day now become even more of a threat in the darkness. The cold winds that whip through the plains at night bring with them more than just discomfort to carry. The risk of hypothermia, especially for those unprepared for the extreme temperature drop. The quiet night is punctuated by unsettling sounds. The howl of coyotes in the distance, the rustle of bushes as a predator moves through the underbrush, or the sharp crack of twigs underfoot. You are constantly vigilant, knowing that outlaws, raiders, or even hungry wildlife could approach at any moment. The desert terrain, with its endless stretches of dry, cracked earth, offered little in the way of natural shelter. You could walk for miles without finding a tree to provide shade, leaving you at the mercy of the sun. Mental exhaustion becomes a natural part of life, especially after months of fighting to survive. Communication was incredibly limited, and even the most basic news took weeks to travel, if at all. A family member could suddenly pass from illness, an injury, or a wild animal attack with no warning. Funerals were simple and quick, often without the comfort of friends or family, and no time was given to mourn. Survivors had to carry on, knowing that their next challenge could be waiting just around the corner. When smallpox or cholera spread through a nearby town, you might not know until after the disease had already arrived at your doorstep. Some succeeded, building successful farms or businesses from the ground up, while others failed and were forced to abandon their claims and move on. To survive a day, let alone a lifetime, in the West meant to constantly adapt, constantly fight, and never assume safety. Even the most seemingly mundane task could turn into a life-or-death situation. The myth of frontier freedom was built on the backs of those who struggled and sacrificed in ways that often went unnoticed. How many of us would truly survive the constant strain and perpetual uncertainty of life in the Wild West? Could we handle the physical challenges of heat, wildlife, And how would our minds endure the psychological toll of such a solitary, harsh existence, where even the smallest mistake could cost us everything? Settlers who lived far from established towns often had to rely on their own resources and resourcefulness to find medical care, which, more often than not, meant they had none at all. The loneliness of frontier life, combined with the constant danger, often led to depression, anxiety, and a sense of hopelessness that would take hold of many settlers. Families who came to the West seeking freedom and opportunity found themselves trapped in an environment that tested their resolve at every turn. The isolation was often overwhelming, and many settlers faced the added challenge of not knowing anyone within miles of their homestead. Dust storms could roll in without warning, blinding you and suffocating you with dirt, making it impossible to see, breathe, or escape the bitter wind. These storms could last hours, sometimes even days, and during these times, survival often meant sheltering in place and waiting it out. While many may imagine the Wild West as a land full of heroic gunfighters, you know that wild game is a valuable resource in the Wild West. But hunting is not guaranteed. In many areas, game is either scarce or too dangerous to hunt without proper gear and knowledge. Bison, once abundant across the plains, were pushed to the brink of extinction by settlers, hunters, and the railroad, leaving many to rely on meager crops or the limited foodstuffs they had managed to grow or trade for. If the winter months approach and the weather turns harsh, food could become nearly impossible to find. Their raids might have been focused on small homesteads like yours families with little means of defending themselves. Even in the night, the threat of wild animals didn't dissipate. Mountain lions, wolves, and bears roamed freely, seeking food and shelter. In many areas, the threat of these predators was constant. The animals did not care if you had a family to protect or crops to harvest. Their instincts were simple: survival. Bears were particularly dangerous during the late summer and fall, when they were fattening up for hibernation and were more aggressive. If you didn't secure your livestock or store food properly, your chances of losing it to an animal attack were high. These outlaws didn't care if you were a law-abiding settler or a hard-working farmer. They only cared about what they could take. If they didn't get what they wanted, the result could be violent and fatal for the unfortunate settler caught in their path. And lawless duels. The reality was that much of the violence was born out of desperation. Desperation for food, shelter, or supplies. Survival wasn't just about facing down a band of outlaws or an Indian raid. It was about enduring the constant struggle of daily life, where the danger was persistent and unpredictable. The bandits that roamed the Wild West were not always the glamorous outlaws depicted in stories, but rather desperate men and women looking to steal whatever they could to survive. At the same time, the land was not just dangerous from human conflict, but even beyond the animals and outlaws. The environment itself was a constant enemy. As night continues, your thoughts drift to food and sustenance. The psychological toll of this constant struggle cannot be underestimated. During these darker times, there were moments when hope felt as fragile as the dry earth beneath your feet. In the secluded frontier, death was often sudden and unpredictable. But despite all the hardship, the Wild West continued to draw settlers from across the United States and beyond, people desperate to carve out a life on the frontier. The truth of survival in the Wild West wasn't glamorous. It was about grit, endurance, and unpredictable danger. Now, as night falls and the stars come out in the sky above, the question arises. The desert landscape of the Wild West is often romanticized as a vast, open space filled with adventure, freedom, and opportunity. However, the harsh reality of life in the desert is far from the idyllic image painted by stories and legends. There's little shelter, with only cactus and sparse brush to provide some form of cover. The desert stretches endlessly, with no trees to block the sun or provide relief. The air feels thick and hot from the moment you wake up, your breath already heavy as the dry heat permeates every part of your body. There are no trees, no rocks, and no buildings to hide under. Heat exhaustion is a common issue for those who spend too much time in the sun without enough water or rest. Your body, unable to sweat out the heat fast enough, begins to suffer. Your skin becomes dry and cracked, your lips blister from lack of moisture, and your tongue feels thick in your mouth as heat and thirst set in. It's easy to become disoriented and confused, making it even more dangerous to go on your journey in search of water or resources. As cattle and wild animals become more desperate for food and water, they can act unpredictably, especially when there is a sudden threat or fear. The dust storms that occasionally roll through the desert can create the perfect conditions for panic among animals, which leads to chaotic behavior that can be dangerous, especially when you're caught in the midst of it. One of the deadliest phenomena of desert life is the false mirage, where heat refracts light in such a way that you see pools of water that do not exist. There are moments when you feel the crushing weight of loneliness and isolation. The vastness of the landscape can make even the simplest decisions seem overwhelming. The lack of any civilization around you only adds to the feeling of being truly alone, with no one to rely on but yourself. This is the reality of life in the Wild West. Desert, a harsh, suffocating environment where survival becomes a day-to-day struggle. Many settlers, out of sheer desperation, would chase after these illusions, only to become more lost and further deep. The desert is a place where life is fragile, and survival hinges on your ability to navigate an unforgiving environment. In a world where water is worth more than gold and the sun can burn away all hope, you are left to wonder, how many people truly understood what it would take to survive a day in the desert, let alone a lifetime? And even more, what secrets might the land hold? Secrets that could either make or break your future in this unforgiving world. You begin to feel dizzy. Your vision blurs, and even the smallest tasks become overwhelming. The lack of sleep under the harsh conditions of day and night takes a toll on your body. Without the comfort of cool evenings, the desert can be just as brutal after the sun sets. While the daytime temperature soars to unbearable levels, night brings a sharp contrast. With temperatures plummeting drastically, often dropping to freezing levels, the extreme temperature fluctuations from blistering heat to intense cold put added pressure on your body's ability to adapt. Hypothermia is a very real concern as well, particularly if you re-caught out at night without enough protection, or if you re-stranded without proper shelter. Delirium can set in quickly when the sun is at its peak, especially if you haven't had enough water or food. You'll see herds of cattle that are left to suffer, some becoming sick from dehydration or heat stroke. If you're a settler raising animals for food or trade, the reality is that livestock can become a vital resource. But in the desert, they are often just as vulnerable to the extreme conditions as you are. If you cannot keep them healthy and hydrated, they, too, can quickly fall ill, and you will be left with a growing burden. Sunstroke or heat stroke, as it is sometimes known, can kill you in a matter of hours. If you re-caught in the heat for too long without relief, your body is constantly baking, and you are forced to keep moving if you want to survive. Even simple tasks like cooking, gathering supplies, or tending to animals become laborious, sweat-drenched undertaking. The ground beneath your feet is burning hot, and with every step, your feet feel like they are being scorched by the sun. This is a land where every physical movement demands great effort, and the heat seems to suck away your energy with each passing hour. Even in the early morning, the heat of the desert can be overwhelming, and you're already sweating before you even begin your daily chores. If you were to survive a day in the desert during the late 1800s, you would quickly find that the sun's blistering heat, the extreme temperatures, if you're lucky, you might have a well or a stream nearby, but these sources are often unreliable. The effort it takes to lower the bucket, pull it back up, and carry the water to your homestead or settlement can feel unending. Each drop feels like a precious commodity, but even a small amount of water, no matter how carefully conserved, could quickly evaporate in the relentless heat. The desert is infamous for its droughts, and even when water does appear, it's often murky, contaminated, and difficult to obtain. Wells can dry up unexpectedly, and without modern plumbing, fetching water means either carrying it by hand from distant locations or relying on rainfall, which is sporadic at best. And the scarcity of resources make this land one of the most difficult places for a human being to endure. The day would begin with the morning sun already high, blazing down on the dry, cracked earth. Your primary concern is water, a resource that is scarce and precious in this environment. In some areas, desert wells are so deep that a single trip to draw water requires hours of hard labor. As the sun climbs higher, the temperature soars, reaching unbearable levels by midday. The desert offers no shade. The heat in the desert doesn't just drain your strength, it affects your mind as well. By the afternoon, if you're not careful, the risk of dehydration becomes a real threat, even if you have managed to find some form of water or shelter. The desert doesn't provide an easy place for rest. Animals struggle to survive in the desert's heat. Even worse, you could find yourself facing a stampede. With the sun still hanging high above, the desert feels like an infinite stretch of time, and your resources feel even more finite. As you sit down for what little rest you can find, you realize that tomorrow will be just as demanding as today. As you push through the blistering afternoon heat, the realization sets in that survival in the desert is not just about endurance, but about a careful balance of resources and timing. The heat isn't the only challenge you'll face. The landscape, while vast and seemingly beautiful, is full of subtle traps that can quickly lead to disaster. Even the simplest of mistakes can become life-threatening in a place where the elements have the upper hand. The dry desert winds sweep relentlessly through the barren terrain, picking up dust and sending it flying into your face. A good shelter requires skill, patience, and often the ability to improvise using the limited resources at hand. A lack of shade during the peak heat of the day can leave you burned. Even if you're diligent about covering your skin, the burns become painful as your skin peels, leaving you vulnerable to infection. The desert is filled with microbes and bacteria, many of which thrive in the dry, arid conditions, while wild game like rabbits, deer, and bison can be found. Hunting is a difficult and often unsuccessful endeavor. Even if you were fortunate enough to plant crops, the irrigation systems you relied on were often rudimentary. The isolation, combined with the constant pressure to survive, left many settlers on the verge of exhaustion and despair. Without the support of a larger community or reliable resources, the mental toll of desert life was immense. Could you adapt to a life where every moment was spent battling not just the elements, but the loneliness, danger, and psychological pressure of the harshest environment imaginable? Many found it difficult to maintain hope, especially when the threat of disease, wildlife, and hostile human interaction constantly loomed over them. The constant vigilance required for survival could wear a person down, leading to feelings of hopelessness and loneliness. And crop failures due to drought or poor soil conditions were a common problem. For the average settler, it was the mundane tasks of day-to-day survival, finding water, securing shelter, and avoiding danger that defined their existence. The challenge was in the small things: the constant vigilance against the heat, the scarcity of resources, and the ever-present danger of being forgotten by the world outside. Without modern-day irrigation techniques, it was easy to lose your entire crop after months of labor. Even if crops survived the heat, they still had to contend with pests, diseases, and the sporadic nature of rainfall. For many settlers, farming in the desert became a gamble and endless struggle with nature that only rewarded those who could persevere. The terrain is challenging to navigate, and the animals are elusive, often retreating deeper into the brush or up into the mountains. If you're lucky enough to catch something, you still have to contend with the difficulty of preserving it in such a hot, dry climate. Drying or smoking meat was one option, but without proper equipment, most settlers had to rely on what they could grow themselves. Small cuts, such as those you might get while building a shelter or dealing with livestock, can become infected quickly, leading to conditions like gangrene, a threat that has claimed many lives in frontier setting. With few trees to cut for wood and no permanent buildings in sight, you might need to rely on brush or cactus fibers to construct a makeshift tent or even with these materials, a well-built shelter is hard to come by, and often the best you can do is find a rock overhang or the side of a hill to offer some small protection from the sun and wind. Your skin is already chapped from the sun, and now the dust seems to permeate every part of you. You pull your scarf tighter over your face, trying to shield yourself from the relentless gusts. You can feel your body beginning to shrivel up from lack of hydration, and you realize that your water reserves are running dangerously low. If you were living in a remote area, it could be days before rainwater collected in barrels, or weeks before you could get to a spring or stream far away. The simple act of finding water could take hours, sometimes days, depending on where you were located. Every trip to a water source, especially in the summer, was an exhausting and risky journey. If you had to travel far to collect water, you risked not only the heat and dehydration, but also potential wildlife attacks or the threat of hostile encounters with other settlers or outlaws. In the desert, water is often far between, and many settlers had to rely on rainwater collection or dug wells. But even these were unreliable. Wells could dry up in an instant, and rainstorms were sporadic, often leaving the land parched for months at a time. In the desert, a building or makeshift shelter is more than just a place to sleep at. Your defense against the elements. Without adequate shelter, you could be exposed to the extreme temperature fluctuations that come with desert life. The heat of the day, which can easily reach over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, gives way to freezing cold at night. The temperature drops dramatically, and if you haven't prepared for the night properly, whether by gathering wood for warmth or building a windbreak, you could risk hypothermia. The sandstorms that occasionally appear on the horizon seem to come out of nowhere, and when they hit, they can be more than just uncomfortable. They can be deadly. During these dust storms, the visibility drops to near zero. A person can get lost in the storm without ever realizing it, making a simple walk to collect water or firewood a risky endeavor. In these conditions, it's easy to become disoriented or wander off course. And once the storm passes, you could be far from your shelter, with little hope of retracing your steps. The dust, too, can clog the throat and irritate the lungs, making breathing difficult and increasing the risk of respiratory infections. Even if you manage to avoid the sandstorms, there are still the issues of shelter and protection. The lack of shelter is a constant threat in the desert, and building it requires more than just the ability to stack some rocks or timber. But even with the most thorough preparations, the desert has a way of punishing mistakes. As you continue your work, your mind begins to focus on the water supply again. For settlers who didn't have access to a reliable water source, water was precious, one of the most coveted and fought-over resources. In addition to water, another essential resource in the desert is food. The heat and dry conditions of the desert make agriculture difficult, to say the least. The harsh conditions of the desert didn't just impact your body. They were a constant strain on your mental fortitude. In the end, survival in the desert was never just about bravery or adventure. It was about resilience, adaptability, and the will to endure. Would you be able to endure a lifetime of these grueling conditions in the Wild West desert? As the days stretch on in the desert, the intensity of survival becomes less about facing immediate threats and more about the mental endurance required to endure an existence in such a harsh environment. Every resource is precious, and the need to constantly manage supplies, whether water, food, or firewood, becomes a full-time job. The dramatic temperature fluctuations between day and night can lead to conditions like hypothermia if you're caught off guard, unprepared for the sudden drop in temperature. As the desert evening air grows cold and biting, you seek refuge in your makeshift shelter or huddle close to your campfire. Hunting for food or gathering supplies now takes on a more methodical, cautious approach. A small mistake, like not securing your meat properly or being careless with your tools, could lead to disaster. The scavengers, both human and animal, are constantly searching for weaknesses, hoping for any chance to take what little you have left. It's during these long hours of darkness that the psychological weight of isolation presses down. Without reliable access to clean water, every moment of the day becomes consumed with the fear of running out. The desert landscape can deceive you, making you think you've found a source of water, a dry creek bed, a distant oasis, only to discover that it has long since dried up. Without this precious resource, all the plans, strategies, and hard work you've put into your day would be for nothing. The vibrant sunrises and majestic sunsets bring a sense of calm, offering a brief reprieve from the endless battle of survival. You realize that the decisions you make now, regarding where you go, where you set up camp, how much water you take with you, and how you secure your food, will determine your future. And where one moment of unpreparedness can erase everything you've worked for, there is no time for mistakes. Every step you take must be carefully considered, and each day that passes without a major setback is a small victory in itself. During these fleeting moments, you might find some peace, realizing that the desert's beauty, the colors of the sky shift from warm oranges to cool purples, and the quiet of the vast desert provides a sense of connection to something bigger than yourself. What happens when the desert finally takes its toll? When the endless struggle becomes too much for even the most resilient and determined person to withstand? Out in the vast expanse of the desert, you might go days without speaking to anyone, only the occasional sound of wildlife or the rustle of the wind to break the silence. Self-reliance becomes your most important ally. The ability to adapt, to constantly rethink strategies, and to rely on your resourcefulness is what keeps you alive in this unforgiving land. Some manage to build successful ranches or farms, growing enough to not only feed themselves, but also sell to nearby towns. Others, however, were simply overwhelmed by the brutal conditions. They left behind their homes, their families, and their dreams, moving on in search of more fertile land, perhaps never to return, in a land where hope and despair are often intertwined. Those who stay must constantly reckon with the reality of survival, knowing that every day is a battle. Every decision you make has consequences, and in the desert, there's no room for error. The mental toll of loneliness is undeniable. You wake each morning knowing that each task, from fetching water to protecting your livestock, could be your last. If you make even the smallest error, the physical exhaustion from the scorching sun, dehydration, and the ever-present danger of wildlife attacks becomes the backdrop to an ongoing struggle with loneliness, isolation, and the ever-looming threat of failure. After weeks of surviving on meager rations and scarce water, it becomes clear that life in the desert is an unforgiving test of both mind and body. The nights, which once brought relief from the burning sun, have transformed into a test of cold becomes a new enemy. With the stillness of night setting in, the land takes on a different, more ominous tone. Predators like mountain lions and coyotes become bolder, more desperate for food. They roam the desert at night, and if you aren't careful, your livestock or crops could be decimated overnight. Protecting your animals from hungry predators becomes a nightly routine, requiring constant vigilance. Snakes, to seek shelter from the cold, often hiding in the same places you might retreat for warmth. At times, it feels like a constant game of cat and mouse, where any misstep could result in the loss of everything you've worked for. Despite all the challenges, there are moments when you begin to notice how the desert shapes your perspective. But these moments of peace they remind you that survival in the desert is not about finding solace, but about embracing the harshness of your environment. For many settlers, the desert quickly became a trap, a place where hope could either flourish or fade. The lack of water continues to be the central issue for those living in the desert. By now, desperation has begun to creep in. The desert does not offer second chances. It is a place where life can change in an instant, where a single misstep or an unlucky event can lead to death. As the night grows deeper, the question lingers in your mind. How long can you hold on in this harsh, unforgiving environment? In the Wild West, the lack of proper medical care was a constant threat to survival. While we often hear tales of famous gunfights, horseback rides, and prospecting for gold, the true battles settlers faced were often with disease, infection, and lack of resources. The closest doctor might be miles away, and in the more remote areas, there might not be a doctor at all, and rest, often with little understanding of what the underlying problem truly was. A common remedy might involve drinking a tea made from willow bark, known to contain salicin, a precursor to modern aspirin. to relieve pain and fever. Without anesthesia or sterile equipment, the mere thought of surgery was terrifying. Settlers had no access to the variety of modern drugs that can easily be found today, so even common illnesses like pneumonia or malaria could result in death. While quinine, an early treatment for malaria, was known and sometimes available, it wasn't always easy to find or use effectively. Although the disease was known to the settlers, and the smallpox vaccination was developed in the 18th century, it wasn't always available or widely accepted in the Wild West. If you were young, your chances of survival were higher, but if you were older, or if you already had an existing condition, the risks were far greater. For those who survived, the scarcity of proper medical care meant that they were constantly reminded of how vulnerable they were, even as the Wild West mythos grew to glorify the lives of those who braved the frontier. The reality of living and dying in such a harsh place was often overlooked. Settlers who were exposed to the disease often faced an agonizing and slow death from the complications, or worse, passed it along to their families. People didn't have access to hospitals, pharmaceuticals, or doctors trained in modern medicine. The closest thing to a doctor might be a family member with basic knowledge of herbal remedies, or a traveling medic who offered what little help they could with primitive tools. For many, medical assistance didn't come until it was too late. Whole communities could be wiped out by a single outbreak, with no way to stop the spread of the disease. Once it arrived, it was dangerous because of the simple realities of life, where even a small illness could wipe out entire families, and where the lack of medical resources meant that survival depended on luck, resilience, and the ability to live without modern conveniences that we take for granted today. For those without access to the correct resources, something as simple as a cold could quickly spiral into a much more serious condition. How long could you hold out, relying on herbal remedies, in the hope that a local medic would make it to your home before it was too late? If you needed an amputation due to a gangrene infection or an accident, you would have to endure the excruciating pain without any numbing or painkillers. By the time the settlers learned of an outbreak, it was often too late. In the 19th century, cholera, smallpox, and typhoid fever were common diseases that wreaked havoc on populations. The symptoms of cholera severe, diarrhea, and dehydration could lead to death in a matter of hours if not treated. But treatment options were minimal, with no antibiotics and limited medical supplies. Many settlers were helpless in the face of a disease they didn't fully understand. For most, surgery meant only the quickest, most brutal methods to stop the spread of infection, often resulting in an amputated limb. Local barbers, sometimes doubling as the nearest medical help, would serve as the only option. Barbers were skilled with a razor, but that didn't mean they were qualified to perform major surgeries or clean wounds in a way that would ensure healing. While this might bring temporary relief, it wouldn't address the root cause of the illness. Without the ability to properly diagnose or treat diseases, settlers were left vulnerable to infections that could spiral out of control. Instead, you would have to rely on the local remedies passed down from neighbors or settlers who had little more than anecdotal knowledge of herbal medicine. The soothing herbs and medicinal plants that grew wild in the area were often your best bet for treatment, but they were far from reliable. Unlike today, where medical technology has made great strides, the people of the Wild West had to rely on rudimentary treatments, herbal remedies, and sometimes nothing at all. Getting sick or injured could easily lead to death, and even a minor issue like a simple cut or fever could escalate into a life-threatening situation in the blink of an eye. Without modern sanitation or knowledge of sterilization, even a minor wound could become infected. The lack of clean water and proper hygiene meant that even small cuts from knife accidents or splinters could lead to tetanus, a deadly bacterial infection that caused muscle stiffness and spasms, often resulting in death. Without a proper antiseptic or bandage, wounds could become breeding grounds for bacteria, and infections could spread rapidly. The dangerous bacteria in the environment, combined with the lack of medical treatment, made even the simplest injury a potential death sentence. If you were unlucky enough to become ill in the Wild West, you would have few options available. For many settlers, the only treatment for common ailments like fever, headaches, or stomach pains was a combination of herbal teas. When an injury occurred, whether from a fall, an accident, or something as simple as a cut, while working with tools, the consequences were dire. Surgery in the Wild West was another dangerous affair. The lack of access to medication was also a severe problem. Another danger settlers faced was disease outbreaks. Without modern communication systems, it could take weeks or even months before news of an epidemic reached a particular settlement. Smallpox was particularly devastating. The constant presence of dangerous diseases and injuries was a major factor in the fragility of life on the frontier. Healthcare, as we know it today, didn't exist in the Wild West. So, the Wild West wasn't just dangerous because of its lawlessness, gunfights, or outlaws. Would you have been able to survive such dire conditions with no access to modern medicine? As the day progresses, the physical challenges of living in the Wild West are compounded by the constant threat of illness. For settlers, the fear of falling ill was often as great, if not greater, than the threat of outlaws or wild animals. Disease was a silent killer, sweeping through towns and homesteads with frightening speed, often claiming the lives of young and old alike. Before there was even time to properly respond, the landscape of medicine in the Wild West was a patchwork of folk remedies, superstitions, and whatever knowledge could be gathered from traveling doctors or herbalists. Those with access to resources like quinine, morphine, and alcohol could fare better, but those living in more isolated regions had nothing but their ingenuity and the teachings passed down by their ancestors. Symptoms such as persistent coughing, fever, and weight loss often went undiagnosed or ignored, especially when pioneers were focused on survival rather than seeking medical care. Some used a local herb known for its supposed healing powers, while others turned to spirits or potions made from plants. While some of these remedies may have had minor effects, none could truly cure tuberculosis. By the time settlers could afford a trip to a doctor, the disease would often have spread too far. Many frontier doctors were self-taught or had a basic understanding of anatomy, which often meant that treatments were either too little, too late, or entirely ineffective. Imagine being struck by a sudden illness, followed by an infection from a wound, all while struggling with the oppressive heat and dehydration of the desert. If you didn't have access to clean water, food, or medical care, you were left to fend for yourself with little hope of surviving. Herbalists or midwives were often the first point of contact for families dealing with illness, and they relied on local plants and remedies passed down through generations. While some of these treatments had modest success, many were ineffective, leading to prolonged suffering and, in many cases, death. How would you fare in a world where even the simplest ailments could lead to death, and survival meant relying on limited knowledge and resources? This meant that many people died alone, with no one capable of administering any relief. It was not uncommon for someone to live with TB for years before it became fatal. But in their sheer resilience, their ability to endure and keep pushing forward even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Death was an ever-present specter in the Wild West, lurking in every illness and every injury, and those who survived often did. So not because of their strength or luck, but because they managed to make it through one day at a time, armed only with the limited resources available to them. During outbreaks, the disease spread rapidly, causing fever, fatigue, and the formation of pus-filled blisters across the body. Smallpox killed around 30% of its victims, and survivors often faced disfigurement from scars. In a time when medical supplies were scarce, and treatments were based more on folklore than medical knowledge, smallpox outbreaks had devastating effects on settlements. And by that time, it was often too late for treatment, leaving only the option of palliative care. Even then, these remedies were often limited and, at best, only partially effective. Let's consider an outbreak of cholera, one of the deadliest diseases to hit settlements across the Wild West. Cholera, a disease caused by contaminated water, would ravage an entire community in days. Bleeding was a common treatment for many ailments, including fevers, infections, and headaches. It was believed that removing bad blood would balance the body as humors and help restore health. Unfortunately, the practice often made patients weaker, and in the case of severe infections, it would lead to an even greater loss of blood, making recovery almost impossible. The town might have a few residents knowledgeable in herbal remedies or basic hydration, but with the epidemic spreading, there would be no time to save everyone. The closest doctor, assuming one was even nearby, might be weeks away, leaving people to fend for themselves. Quarantines and social distancing weren't even concepts, so when disease took root, it could wipe out entire families in a matter of days. The first sign of illness was often a sudden onset of diarrhea and vomiting. The death rate from cholera in some areas was as high as 50%, with those affected often dying within hours of the first symptoms. In this situation, a settler might have no choice but to rely on water from a nearby river or a well, both of which could easily be contaminated. Without access to modern antibiotics or the ability to quickly sterilize water, your chances of survival in such a scenario would depend on luck alone. Even a simple bout of food poisoning, which today would likely be treated with a course of antibiotics, could become a life or death situation, with people succumbing to the effects of dehydration or infection. Because no one had the tools to properly treat it, many settlers succumbed to illnesses that would have been relatively harmless in more developed areas, tuberculosis, and even the common cold, because they lacked the medical infrastructure to address the complications that arose. Another common ailment was tuberculosis, a slow-acting and often deadly disease that attacked the lungs. Treatments for TB in the Wild West ranged from the rudimentary to the superstitious. The presence of smallpox further compounded the dangers. While vaccines for smallpox existed by the late 1800s, they were not widely available or trusted in the Wild West. If you were one of the lucky few to have access to some form of medical care, your chances of survival might improve. But even then, the methods used were primitive by modern standards. Doctors, such as they were often poorly trained, and their diagnoses could be based on little more than guesswork. One of the worst scenarios settlers faced was when multiple diseases or injuries struck at once. In the face of these challenges, the strength of the settlers wasn't necessarily in their ability to fight the elements or outlaws. As you consider what life was truly like on the frontier, you have to ask yourself, how many settlers were forced to face the harsh realities of illness and injury without hope of recovery? As the days in the Wild West stretch on, the grim reality of illness and injury begins to sink in. It's not the gunfights, outlaws, or wild animals that claim the most lives in this unforgiving land. It's the small things, the everyday ailments that often lead to death. Settlers had to rely on some. There are no hospitals to visit and no clinics to seek care. Your only option is to consult a local healer who might offer an herbal remedy or tell you to simply wait it out. If you were struck by an infection, especially one stemming from an injury, these individuals often traveled the frontier, peddling their own brand of medicine. Some sold herbal concoctions, while others promised miracle cures for anything from headaches to gonorrhea. In many cases, their products were ineffective at best and dangerous at worst. The isolation of frontier life often led to loneliness and mental health problems, which were largely ignored or dismissed by most settlers. The constant stress of surviving in such a harsh environment, coupled with the inability to seek proper care when illness struck, led to an overwhelming sense of hopelessness for many. The lack of medical care, the distance from doctors, and the often inadequate treatments meant that settlers were constantly battling the threat of disease, injury, and death, with little recourse for relief. But in a place where hope was in short supply, settlers often turned to these charlatans out of desperation. And how much is hidden in the silent deaths caused by the simple realities of life in such a lawless, harsh environment? Could you endure the constant struggle against not just the elements and outlaws, but the dangerous diseases, infection, and mental toll that slowly chipped away at the settlers' will to survive? The pressure of long hours, the constant threat of disease, the isolation, and the harsh climate left many struggling to maintain their mental health. Depression and anxiety were likely common, But with no language to understand these ailments and no tools to treat them, people simply carried on, often silently suffering. In some cases, the mental strain led to more tragic outcomes. Suicide, for example, was likely more common in frontier life than records suggest. But it was seldom documented, and gangrene set in. A doctor or a local barber would be forced to remove the affected limb. Without hospitals or trained midwives, most women gave birth at home, sometimes alone or with the help of family members. Complications during labor were common, and without the proper medical intervention, many mothers and infants died. Postpartum infections were a common cause of death, as sepsis could set in quickly, especially when sterile practices were non-existent. The procedure was typically performed without anesthesia. The patient would be strapped down, often held in place by family or friends, and the limb would be sawed off. The fear of infection from a non-sterile environment and the absence of antibiotics meant that even if the amputation saved your life, there was a high chance that the operation itself would eventually cause death. But in reality, your condition could be a case of tuberculosis, a disease that might take months to show severe symptoms, but that is slowly eating away at your lungs. By the time you're diagnosed, it may already be too late. Many relied on home remedies, or the local herbalist, who might have only basic knowledge of plants and their uses. Infected wounds were not only painful, but could spread rapidly, leading to blood poisoning or even death. Tetanus, caused by a bacteria found in soil and rust, was another silent killer. If you stepped on a nail or were injured by rusty tools, the resulting tetanus infection could kill you in a matter of days. The only treatment was to rely on the body's immune system, as there was no vaccine, and antibiotics weren't available to fight the infection. Doctors were few and far between, often serving a large number of people across a vast area. House calls were common, but the physician's medicine chest was often limited to basic pills, ointments, and painkillers. If that surgery was a last resort, and even then, it was performed without anesthesia, and often with dirty instruments. The idea of performing complex procedures like appendectomies or treating internal injuries was virtually unheard of in frontier medicine. Most injuries, especially broken bones, were treated with splints or bandages, and the success of such treatments was often left to luck rather than skill. These remedies were hit or miss at best, and in many cases, they provided little relief or even worsened the situation. The lack of proper medicine, the distance from medical help, and the harsh environmental conditions combined to make even the most minor sicknesses or injuries potential death sentences. The concept of doctor-patient relationships, as we know it today, simply didn't exist in the Wild West. Imagine, for instance, that you develop a persistent cough, a symptom you might dismiss at first, but over the course of weeks, it grows worse. Even the best-case scenario in the Wild West being able to find a trained physician offered own limited help. Amputation, when necessary, was a horrifying but not uncommon fate. The scarcity of doctors also meant that, in some cases, quack self-proclaimed healers with little to no formal training would step in. Another significant health challenge was childbirth, a process fraught with danger in the Wild West. Even the simplest injury could be life-threatening. For example, if you cut your leg, the risk of infection was always present. But it wasn't just physical illness that posed a threat, it was the mental toll as well. Without access to psychological care, settlers often had to rely on their own resilience to keep going. The Wild West, while an exciting chapter in American history, was also a land where illnesses and injuries could change the course of one's life in an instant. In a place where even the smallest ailment could endanger life. Massas. How much of the Wild West myth is shaped by tales of adventure and glory? The vast, untamed land of the Wild West was an alluring place for those seeking freedom, opportunity, or simply a fresh start. The promise of land and a better life beckoned. But for those who decided to settle in this harsh environment, the reality of building a home from nothing was a grueling and often dangerous task. Settlers were not just fighting against nature, they were fighting against a landscape that would prove unyielding. Especially if you were unprepared or unlucky, the land might be rugged, uneven, or located near a risky water source. such as a flood-prone river or an unreliable stream, without any maps or established infrastructure. Settlers often had to rely on their instincts, old knowledge, or word of mouth to find a spot where they could build and grow. You'd spend hours, sometimes days, digging and cutting to create a structure that could keep the elements out. The work was physical and exhausting, and because tools were limited and often rudimentary, building a simple shelter could take weeks or even months. If you had a small family to help, the work might move faster. But if you were alone or had few resources, the task could seem endless. Imagine yourself as a settler, arriving in the frontier with a small group of family members, your belongings in a wagon, and a head full of hope. Cattle are essential for both food and trade, but the ranching life is fraught with challenges. First, you must secure land that is capable of sustaining animals, and then you must protect them from the many threats of the wild West predators, storms, and rustlers. Without proper fencing, livestock could wander off or be stolen. Raising animals in the desert or on open plains was risky. During the long summer months, water could become scarce for your herd, and they would need to be carefully managed to avoid overgrazing. Growing enough to feed your family in the Wild West is no easy feat. The promise of a new life on the frontier often fades into the harsh reality of constant labor, fighting against the elements, and a sense of never-ending struggle. While there is freedom to be found in the Wild West, it comes at the costs of hardship, loneliness, and a near-constant battle for survival. No one in the Wild West could afford to be complacent. Every task, no matter how small, was a step toward ensuring that your family, your home, and your livelihood could continue another day. Wild animals, like rabbits, deer, and bears, are known to raid your crops, devouring everything before you can harvest it. Every hour of your day has been spent preparing for the future, but nothing is guaranteed. The question now arises, after all the work and hardship, will you and your family survive in the harsh, unpredictable environment of the Wild West? And what happens when things don't go according to plan? When nature turns against you, or when fellow settlers make choices that affect your future? Insects, especially grasshoppers, could decimate fields of crops within a matter of days. Even the weather, which seemed to offer some hope at times, could turn against you. Heavy rains could flood your fields, while dry spells could dry up what little water you had, leaving your crops to wither. The climate, often dry, harsh, or flood-prone, can destroy a crop before it has a chance to thrive. Soil fertility varies, and even if you are able to plant crops, you need to contend with pests, droughts, and the short growing season. A lack of irrigation further complicates matters, especially if you are located in desert or semi-arid regions. Without modern farming equipment or technology, much of the work had to be done by hand, which made it even more backbreaking. The first thing you must do is secure your homestead, a piece of land that you can call your own. But this is far from an easy task. There is no infrastructure, no towns nearby to buy supplies from. There are no roads or established paths to follow. What started as an optimistic venture quickly turns into a daily struggle to sustain yourself, your family, and your small plot of land. The weight of uncertainty hangs heavily over your days as you realize that each season is a gamble. For many settlers, failure was inevitable, and the best they could hope for was simply to survive until the next season. Shelter is your first concern because, without it, survival is impossible. Some settlers opted for log cabins, but this required an abundance of wood, which could be scarce depending on where you settled. Without nearby trees, many people were forced to build sod houses, or soddies, where the walls and roofs were made from dirt and grass. These homes, though effective at keeping the worst of the wind and cold at bay, were anything but comfortable. Sod homes were small, cramped, and often damp, leading to health problems like respiratory issues due to the lack of proper ventilation. Your land might be located in the desert, mountainous regions, or across miles of barren prairie. Your first challenge is finding a place to settle. Once you've chosen your plot of land, it's time to begin the difficult task of building. The labor required to build such a home was overwhelming. Once the shelter is completed, the next priority is food. While you may have some initial success growing basic crops like corn, wheat, or potatoes, the challenges don't stop there. As you look at your crops and the barren fields around you, you realize that even the most successful settlers faced constant setbacks. Beyond survival, the task of raising livestock is also a monumental undertaking. The harsh realities of surviving in the Wild West mean that settlers constantly fight for the barest essentials. As you sit down at the end of a long day, exhausted from work, you begin to realize just how different life is out here on the frontier. As the days stretch on, your life as a settler on the frontier becomes an endless cycle of work, struggle, and small victories. You've now established your shelter, and your crops, though not thriving, have begun to grow with the season. You've secured a few livestock, and while they aren't plentiful, they are a crucial part of your survival. The promise of land that once seemed like a path to freedom now feels like a constant battle to keep what little you have. The weather in the Wild West is unpredictable, to say the least. If you're not careful, a blister from handling rough tools can become infected, leading to a dangerous infection. The days feel long, and the work doesn't stop when the sun sets. While the outlaws and bandits you've heard of in the tales of the Wild West may seem distant, you know that your homestead, so isolated and vulnerable, could be an easy target for thieves or raiders. Settlers in the Wild West often had to defend their homes and possessions, not just from nature, but from the desperate people who roamed the frontier. The years drag on, and you begin to adjust to the suffering and hardship. You begin to appreciate the simple joys of life that most would take for granted. The stable you've built for your animals, the bounty of a good harvest. Building a home in the Wild West wasn't just about constructing walls. It was about building a future, fighting for survival, and creating a legacy that would live on for generations. And the relief of being able to share a meal around the fire. These moments become treasured reminders that resilience and determination can still lead to a life worth living, even in the most difficult and dangerous conditions. You start to look around and realize that, despite it all, you've made it. The weather, the disease, and the ever-present danger of outlaws haven't claimed you yet. What happens when the land becomes too dry to grow anything? Or the outlaws finally come knocking at your door? The Wild West is unforgiving, and while you may have built a home here, you understand that nothing is guaranteed. In some ways, the frontier life has shaped you into something stronger, more capable. Your hands are rough from labor. Your body aches from the long hours. But your mind is sharper, focused only on survival. Sometimes, it was necessary to carry a gun at all times, not just to defend your life, but to ensure your livelihood. You may have to prepare meals, mend fences, or keep a watchful eye on your livestock, especially at night when predators are active. The desert areas you've settled in are prone to flash floods during spring and summer. These sudden storms can drown out crops, drown livestock, and damage the fragile homes you've worked so hard to build. In the desert, flooding can come out of nowhere, and you must be prepared to defend against it, even if you're not certain of when or where it will strike. Coyotes, wolves, and even mountain lions could be lurking nearby, ready to attack your animals if they are left unprotected. A single night of inattention could lead to the loss of one or more of your prized animals, a loss that could spell the end of your family's food and income. If your clothes get torn or stained, you risk exposure to the elements. The lack of modern clothing or material resources means you must be resourceful, repairing your boots, patching up your shelter, and reusing anything you can find. There's no store to visit for a quick fix, no online shopping to deliver supplies. Every penny you spend has to count, and every decision must be weighed carefully. One day, it's hot, dry, and scorching, leaving the earth cracked and dusty. The next, a rainstorm floods the land, bringing a new set of challenges. Your crops could be washed away in an instant, leaving you without any food to rely on. Even if the storms don't destroy your harvest, they create new problems. The soil so dry in the summer becomes too soft and waterlogged, making it nearly impossible to work the land. Water, which seemed so abundant in your initial enthusiasm, has become a precious commodity, The stream near your homestead often dries up during the summer, and you're left having to travel long distances to find fresh water. It's not just the humans you're worried about, it's your animals, too. Cattle, sheep, and horses require large quantities of water to survive, and without it, they quickly become weak or die. You've learned to dig for wells, but they're often shallow, leading to the same problem as the stream water depletion. And yet, you must keep moving forward. You can't afford to let these challenges break you. You find yourself working long hours each day, often well past sundown. The work is physically exhausting weather. You're digging irrigation channels, mending fences, tending to crops, or caring for animals. There's no time for rest, no room for luxury. Life is about bare survival, and every task is vital for the continued existence of your homestead. Even the smallest inconvenience can spiral into a life-threatening problem. In the afternoons, when the sun is at its hottest, you and your family will often retreat to the shade of the shelter, resting briefly before the evening tasks begin. The threat of lawlessness in the Wild West is always in the back of your mind. When it's not animals or raiders threatening your existence, it's the weather again. And yet, there is a certain grit that settles in your bones as you continue to survive. Over time, the promise of land doesn't seem as important as the fact of survival. Despite the immense hardships, there's also a strange sense of satisfaction in the work, knowing that you've created something from nothing, carved out a piece of life in the wilderness. But as you look out across the vast, empty land that surrounds your home, you can't help but wonder, how long can this last? As time passes, the initial excitement of settling in the Wild West begins to fade into the harsh reality of a daily struggle for survival. What once seemed like a place of opportunity now feels more like a relentless battle against nature and the constant uncertainty of frontier life. The mental toll of living on the frontier begins to weigh heavily. The desert climate demands that you think constantly about your water supply, and many days are spent finding new sources or reinforcing existing wells to ensure you don't run dry. The cold winters bring an entirely new set of challenges. The spring floods, a common occurrence in many parts of the Wild West, can wash away everything you've worked for. Perhaps the water source you've relied on begins to dry up or becomes contaminated. It's a reminder that the land isn't just a gifted, a demanding partner. You've fought hard to build a life here, but the reality is that with each passing year, you must fight just as hard to maintain it. However, as the years go by, you begin to feel the weight of it all. The invisible burden of the constant battle against the environment, the isolation from your loved ones, and the pressure to succeed in a world where the odds are stacked against you. The mental and emotional exhaustion of frontier life makes it difficult to imagine anything beyond the next day's struggle. Settlers often had no idea what the next year would bring, and for many, the idea of settling down to enjoy their work seemed like a distant, unattainable dream. The struggle for survival is a never-ending cycle. Even when things seem to be improving, your crops yield a good harvest, or your livestock thrive, you can never let your guard down. Disaster could strike at any moment, and the land that you fought so hard to tame will remind you, often in the most unforgiving ways, that it is still untamed. Anxiety over the future creeps in, and moments of doubt make you question whether it's all worth it. Children, who should be learning in a safe, nurturing environment, grow up surrounded by constant danger and the reality of survival. They work alongside you, helping to tend to the animals, gather food, or assist with building projects. Was the dream of a better life, of a piece of land you could call your own, truly the answer to the hardships you've endured? Or was it just another piece of the endless cycle of struggle that defines life in the Wild West? While this gives them the chance to learn valuable skills, it also robs them of a childhood that is filled with play and imagination. Their survival, like yours, depends on their ability to adapt quickly to a harsh, often dangerous environment. Guilt may set in when you wonder if you've failed your family, or when you see the harsh reality of living in a place where death, disease, and failure are never far behind. Fields of crops can be destroyed, livestock can be drowned, and roads can become. The loneliness you feel from being so far removed from civilization can't be overstated. As time wears on, the small town nearby becomes more of a lifeline than a community. You might make the long journey to trade goods or buy supplies, but you are still a stranger in a strange land. Social connections are scarce, and while there may be friendly neighbors, the overall isolation remains a constant feature of your life. The unpredictability of the weather means that you cannot rely on anything, not even the earth beneath your feet, to stay the same. Every season, every year, you have to prepare for the worst, knowing that nature can turn against you in an instant. Without central heating, the cold creeps into your bones, making the simplest tasks like gathering firewood or even getting out of bed feel like monumental efforts. Snowstorms are frequent, and they can trap you inside your shelter for days, sometimes weeks at a time. With the lack of modern insulation and shoddy building materials, the cold is almost unbearable, and hypothermia is always a risk. The land that promised freedom now feels like a place of loneliness and constant hardship. Every decision you make feels like it could lead to success or failure. No safety net, no certainty. Even the smallest of choices, such as where to plant your crops or whether to invest in new tools, can result in either great reward or disastrous loss. Even in the best-case scenarios, the water is often murky, unreliable, and full of minerals that you can't remove without proper equipment. You have to make do with what's available, and sometimes that means drinking water that's barely fit for washing, let alone drinking. The days are long and repetitive. The same tasks are waiting you at dawn, and the same weariness pulling at you by nightfall. The work feels endless, mending fences, tending to crops, and ensuring your animals are safe from predators. But as time goes on, even these small successes, such as a good harvest or the birth of a healthy calf, become. The sense of freedom that originally attracted you to the frontier is overshadowed by the hardship and dangers of a life spent in isolation, surrounded by a land that gives only what it chooses to give. Now that your shelter is stable and your livestock is somewhat secure, your focus shifts to maintaining what you've built. What once a commodity you took for granted is now a constant source of stress. The seasons in the Wild West aren't just passing time. They're a reminder of how vulnerable you are. When the spring thaw finally comes, it brings its own set of dangers. As the seasons change, so does the land. Over several years, you may notice that the soil in your fields begins to lose its fertility. On the more social side of things, you may have occasional interactions with other settlers or nearby towns. As you go about your daily tasks, you realize that the Wild West, with its vast expanses of open land and freedom, can also feel like an immense prison. The mental strain is something many settlers never spoke about. How could they? Everyone was too busy fighting to survive. The ever-present fear of disaster weather. It's from a crop failure, a disease outbreak, or a winter storm is compounded by the psychological toll of living in such a harsh, unforgiving land. Raising a family on the frontier is equally difficult. As you grow older, you begin to realize the heavy costs of what it took to build a home in the Wild West. At the end of the day, after the physical exhaustion, the emotional strain, and the constant fight to survive, you sit down in your humble shelter, reflect on the day's work, and wonder, was it worth it? The Wild West, with its promise of freedom and opportunity, was a land of vast expanses, where the horizon stretched endlessly in every direction. Yet, for those who settled there, the reality of this wide-open space was one of stark isolation. Open space to call your own, land where you can build a life, a farm, and a future for yourself and your family. But the freedom that comes with this wide expanse of land often comes at the cost of being alone, isolated from the rest of the world, cut off from any form of community or support. The physical exhaustion from daily labor, whether it was tending to crops, caring for livestock, or building and maintaining shelter, was compounded by the emotional toll of solitude. There are no telephones or easy mail services to keep in touch with loved ones, or even to find out what's happening in the rest of the world. And the only interactions you might have for weeks at a time were with your family, small group of people who shared the same daily struggles, but also the same fears and doubts. There were no distractions, no sense of escape. Even a simple trip to the local town could be an event you looked forward to. But these trips, if they even occurred, were few and far between. If illness or injury struck, you were often left to your own devices. There were no doctors nearby, no hospitals to visit, and no one around to help if something went wrong. A simple injury could become a life-threatening issue if left untreated, and a fever or illness could easily turn deadly without any medical assistance. The constant threat of disease, whether from the elements or from contaminated water or food, was always present, and being isolated meant that help was often too far away to be of use. Could you keep going day after day without the support of a larger community? Or would the loneliness of frontier life eventually wear you down? You had to plan well ahead, knowing that the journey could take several days, and that anything you forgot to bring with you could leave you stranded for longer than expected. A flash flood could wash away everything you'd worked for, and the threat of wild animals was always looming. The quiet of the desert or the open plains might once have been peaceful, but it soon becomes overwhelming. In many cases, the isolation was not something settlers could ever truly prepare for. It was an invisible weight that came with the territorial reality of life in the Wild West that was just as dangerous, just as debilitating as the harsh environment itself. If you were alone in the wilderness, even a small injury or a misstep could prove to be fatal. The loneliness, the isolation, the lack of community, all of these factors came together to create a life that was defined by and without anyone around to help, your chances of survival were slim. If you had access to news, it often came weeks or months too late. For women who often found themselves responsible for both the domestic chores and the farm work, the weight of isolation could be particularly crushing. Without any female companions to share the load or talk to, the sense of isolation was often accompanied by a deep loneliness. Men, too, who spent most of their days working outdoors, were often left without a support network to turn to for advice, companionship, or help. The only reliable form of contact was through passing travelers or the occasional town visit, both of which were rare and often costly. The emotional toll of solitude, combined with the physical toll of survival, could lead to feelings of despair, anxiety, and depression. There were no clinics, no therapists, and no one to talk to about the mounting pressures of life on the frontier. Without any kind of formal system to address mental health, settlers were left to manage their emotions as best they could, often turning inward or relying on religion and faith to help them cope, without any real way to reach out to the outside world. The isolation felt even more acute. Over time, the distance from family and friends, the lack of social interaction, and the absence of support networks led to feelings of despair and mental fatigue. The distance between families and settlements meant that social interaction was scarce. For those living on homesteads far from towns, or even other settlers, it was not uncommon to go weeks, months, or even years without encountering another soul. The challenges of survival were not just physical. The mental toll of living in such a remote and sparse land was one of the greatest struggles settlers faced. The solitude was often overwhelming, and for many, it was this sense of loneliness that became the hardest battle to fight. When you first arrive on the frontier, the land seems full of possibilities. At first, the loneliness might be something you can bear, perhaps even romanticize. There's a sense of independence, the freedom to live without interference, to work the land and follow your own rules. However, this sense of pride quickly fades when the weight of isolation begins to sink in. The silence becomes deafening, and the days stretch on without any change, with only the sounds of nature or the occasional wild animal to break the stillness. For many settlers, especially those living in remote areas, the mental strain of isolation was as challenging as the physical demands of survival. When you are isolated on the frontier, communication becomes an arduous process. The closest neighbor might be miles away. This loneliness didn't just affect individuals, it affected entire families. In many cases, this isolation led to mental health struggles that were rarely acknowledged or treated. In addition to the mental toll, there were also physical dangers that came with being isolated. Even the natural elements posed a constant threat. A A snowstorm could leave you trapped in your cabin for days, with no way to get food or firewood. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the loneliness of the Wild West becomes suffocating. At times, it seemed as if the land had been designed to test not just your physical strength, but your mental resilience. Would you have the strength to endure such severe isolation, knowing that you would face each day alone, with only your family and the wild land for company? As time passes in the wild and remote expanses of the frontier, the feeling of loneliness becomes not just a part of daily life, but a powerful force that shapes every interaction and decision. The land that promised freedom and independence often exacts a heavy price: isolation. While summers are filled with the relentless labor of planting, harvesting, and tending to livestock, the cold months bring a different kind of burden. The severe cold often traps you and your family inside your small cabin or soddy for days at a time. As the primary caregivers of children, animals, and a household, they were often left with little interaction beyond the confines of their own home. Women on the frontier had to be strong, working alongside their husbands, keeping up with domestic chores, managing crops, and raising children. But there were few opportunities to meet other women or even engage in lighthearted conversation. Without anyone around to offer guidance or reassurance, you can begin to question your own decisions. Was the land you chose really the right one? Could you have done something differently to make your life here easier? For many settlers, religion offered the only source of emotional support in a world where mental health wasn't a recognized concern. Attending church might have been a rare event, but in the isolation of the Wild West, many settlers turned to their faith to cope. They prayed for strength, for help, and for a sense of connection to something beyond the land. Faith often became a crucial anchor, providing a sense of purpose amid the overwhelming isolation and hardships of life. The isolation allows your mind to spiral, and the constant pressure of ensuring survival can be overwhelming. You long for the companionship of others, for a brief reprieve from the work, but there's no one to turn to. The emotional burden becomes as heavy as the physical labor of life in the Wild West. A woman might only interact with other settlers when family came to visit, or when there was a rare trip to a nearby town, a visitor from the nearest town. The arrival of a passing or even hearing a neighbor's voice across the fence could lift your spirits for a moment. But these moments were fleeting, and soon you were left to your own thoughts once more. The very nature of survival in such an unforgiving land meant that settlers had to endure. They had no other choice. Over time, solitude became a way of life. The loneliness was not overcome, but rather, it was accepted. It was a price paid for the freedom of land, for the promise of independence. Every settler knew that they couldn't survive without facing the hardships, including the long stretches of silence and isolation. But it was that very endurance, that daily fight against the overwhelming loneliness, that allowed them to survive on the frontier. Reading, if you were lucky enough to have a book, became a means of escaping the mental strain, though even a single book could only go so far in easing the feeling of isolation. This constant isolation left many women feeling trapped in their roles, with few options for escape. Snowstorms frequently hit, and the roads are impassable for weeks. While they often spent long hours outdoors, whether tending to crops or caring for livestock, the absence of socializing took its toll. Settlers were often alone in vast stretches of land, with only a small family or a handful of neighbors for company. There were no church services every Sunday, no community events, and no sense of shared belonging to hold on to. In established towns, a sense of community could still be found. Churches and saloons provided the opportunity to interact with others, even if the community was small. But for those who settled in the most isolated corners of the frontier, life was filled with long stretches of silence and seclusion. They might ride into town occasionally, but those trips were brief and often focused on business. The bars and saloons offered some fleeting interaction, but that was often limited to brief exchanges with strangers or acquaintances, many of whom were passing through. The lack of long-term companionship or meaningful conversation left many men feeling isolated and emotionally drained. The hardship of frontier life combined with a lack of connection, led to mental struggles, which were rarely acknowledged or addressed. Many settlers, particularly men, struggled with depression, though they had no language or framework to express what they were feeling. The loneliness is even more pronounced when you're isolated by the snow, unable to visit neighbors or receive any form of help or social interaction. There are no television shows, no friends dropping by for a visit. There's only the quiet, the howling wind, the crunch of snow beneath your boots, and the sounds of your own thoughts echoing back at you in the stillness. In the early days, you may have found a sense of excitement in the quiet and space around you. But as the months stretch into years, the vastness of the open plains and the desolate deserts can feel more like a prison than a place of opportunity. The isolation of the Wild West is particularly challenging during the winter months. During this time, your mental health begins to deteriorate. The physical labor of the Wild West had already taken its toll on your body, but it's the mental toll that begins to chip away at your resolve. The constant solitude means you have few opportunities to vent frustrations or seek advice. There's no one to talk to when you're overwhelmed, no one to share the burden with. Every decision, no matter how small, weighs heavily on your shoulders. You might long for a moment of connection with the outside world, for the chance to hear news of what's happening in the rest of the country. But without access to newspapers or even reliable communication systems, days can pass without any news from beyond your homestead. For the women of the frontier, the loneliness was particularly crushing. For men, the story wasn't much different. The lack of any formal community was perhaps the most difficult aspect of life in the Wild West. In these moments of isolation, it's easy to become consumed by self. Even the smallest of events could be a source of solace, though they were few and far between. During times of struggle, faith played a large role in providing solace. Yet, despite the mental strain, the resilience of frontier life allowed settlers to persevere. As the years pass on the frontier, the isolation that once seemed like an occasional challenge becomes a permanent companion. In the early days of settling on the wild and remote land, there was an initial sense of excitement, freedom, self-sufficiency, and the hope of building a new life. But as the seasons change and the honeymoon phase fades, the harsh reality of loneliness begins to set in, gradually becoming a suffocating presence in daily life. The expansive, open land that once seemed like a blank canvas for a bright future now feels more like a vast desert of silence, where the absence of human interaction becomes a constant emotional weight. For men, the isolation often meant hours of solitary labor. Whether it was working the land, tending to livestock, or making repairs to building and managing household duties, they were often left with little to no interaction with other women, which could be especially isolating. The only companions for a woman living on the frontier might be her children, and even then, the emotional and physical toll of raising them in such harsh conditions could become overwhelming. The sense of community that many settlers longed for was often impossible to achieve in such a vast, uncaring land. The stress of constant labor, combined with the emotional burden of loneliness, could lead to mental exhaustion that often left settlers feeling numb or apathetic. Many settlers suffered in silence, unsure of how to articulate the emotional toll that isolation had taken on their spirits. Unlike today, there were no therapists, no mental health services to help settlers cope with their emotional burden. They were expected to just keep going, to survive, and to find solace in whatever small victories they could. Settlers who lived in isolation began to adjust, not by overcoming loneliness, but by accepting it as part of life. They made peace with the solitude, finding meaning in their work, faith, and the family bonds they had. The isolation, though grueling, also forged a sense of self-reliance and independence that was unmatched. Over time, many settlers came to realize that the ability to survive and thrive in such a harsh environment required more than just physical endurance. It required a kind of inner strength that could endure the solitude, the mental fatigue, and the overwhelming silence of the Wild West. They became accustomed to their own company, finding ways to fill the emptiness through work, faith, and the occasional fleeting connection with others. This resilience was often a quiet one, as most settlers didn't talk about their struggles with loneliness. They pushed through it, day after day, doing what had to be done to survive. The absence of other women to share experiences with, to laugh, cry, or talk freely, was often the most agonizing part of the daily grind. It wasn't unusual for a settler to spend days working alone, without any form of human interaction. The nearest town was often miles away, and even when they could travel, it wasn't always easy to find a place to connect with others. Rituals developed to break up the monotony, perhaps. A family dinner, a weekly walk, or even sharing stories of life back home. In more populated regions, these small acts of connection helped to preserve a sense of normalcy, though they never truly relieved the deep emotional toll of isolation. Even children, growing up in such environments, felt the absence of interaction with others their age. They often spent their youth working alongside their parents, helping with chores or exploring the land. But the lack of peers left them without the same sense of community that children in more populated areas experience. Social gatherings, like church services, dances, or social clubs, were rare and often limited to only the most established settlements. For many women, a trip to town meant a few hours spent shopping or perhaps getting a small bit of socializing, but it was fleeting. These brief encounters were nothing compared to the isolation they faced the rest of the year. While some found comfort in the repetitive nature of the work, others struggled with the overwhelming boredom and the sense that there was no one to share the burden with. For many, the rare visits to town or a passing traveler brought a short-lived sense of connection, but it was often fleeting. The disconnection from a wider community became more and more apparent as time went on. The mental toll of isolation is often underestimated, but for those who lived in the remote corners of the Wild West, it was a silent struggle that defined their existence. In a time when communication was slow and unreliable, a single month without hearing from a neighbor or receiving a letter could feel like an eternity. There were no phones, no radios, and in many cases, no newspapers. News from the outside world could take months to reach you, and by the time it did, the information was often outdated or irrelevant. The idea of community, of socializing with people beyond your immediate family, became an almost foreign concept. Social interaction was often limited to brief exchanges with those few who lived nearby, and even those were sometimes marked by anxiety or discomfort. Due to the sheer awkwardness of interacting with strangers after long periods of solitude, weeks could go by before any sign of another human being appeared, whether it was a passing traveler, a wagon train, or a mail delivery. The few visits you might get were often brief and centered around business trading goods or tending to little room for the companionship that every settler longed for. In moments like these, hope begins to feel fragile. The strain of this isolation took different forms for men and women. For women, the situation was even more extreme. While they often worked just as hard as their male counterparts tending to crops, caring for livestock, there were few ways for women to escape the loneliness. As the years passed, settler families began to create their own unique ways of coping with this isolation. Over time, the struggle with loneliness became a defining feature of frontier life. The emotional isolation of the frontier also had its physical consequences. Despite all this, the settlers of the Wild West did not simply give up, they adapted. In the unforgiving Wild West, where water, food, and fire were the only things standing between you and death, every day was a fight for survival. The land may have promised freedom, but it also demanded respect, and failure to meet the land's harsh terms could cost you your life. Let's continue with water, the most vital resource in such an arid landscape. Whether you were settled in the desert, plains, or mountains, the availability of water determined whether your farm would thrive or die. If you were fortunate enough to be near a natural spring or well, you would have to worry about contamination, animal waste, disease, and poor sanitation all contributed to making water a constant challenge. This often meant smoking, salting, or drying it, methods that took up time and were not always effective. Fire wasn't just essential for cooking. It was needed for warmth, protection from predators, and as a means of signaling for help if you were lost. Fire, however, was also difficult to come by, especially in dry climates, where wood was scarce. Settlers often had to gather firewood during the fall months to prepare for the harsh winter, but this wasn't always enough. The long hours, the constant worry, the physical labor, it all added up. Even when you succeeded in providing for your family, the land could take it all away in an instant. It was a land that didn't give back. In the Wild West, nothing was guaranteed. Only through perseverance, adaptability, and resourcefulness could you hope to survive another year. If your firewood ran out, you were left to endure the cold of winter without the means to stay warm. A dangerous prospect when temperatures could dip below freezing. And during the summer, when wildfires could break out due to dry conditions, a simple mistake with fire could devastate everything in its path. A bad harvest, a failed hunt, or a contaminated water source meant the difference between survival and starvation. Without it, settlers were left with raw food or less than ideal solutions like stone cooking or campfires that didn't provide consistent heat. As a settler, your success or failure rested on your ability to find water, secure food, and keep your fire burning. Everything you did, whether planting crops, raising animals, or hunting for game, was dictated by the constant battle for survival. The struggle was constant, and the unpredictability of nature meant that you could be thriving one season and on the brink of disaster the next. Each day was a gamble if you didn't manage your resources correctly. Even the simplest tasks, like preparing a meal, could become a struggle. If the crops failed or the livestock died, settlers were left with limited options often, forcing them to rely on whatever wild plants they could forage, many of which were unfamiliar and not always safe to eat. Wild game was sparse in certain regions, and the animals that were plentiful, such as rabbits or deer, often required skill and patience to catch. Hunting wasn't just a matter of walking into the woods and bringing down an animal. You had to be silent, patient, and prepared to deal with whatever wildlife you encountered. Even the simplest of tools, as a rifle, trap, or bow, could break. Often, you would have to boil water to ensure it was safe to drink. But this required fire and wood resources that were also limited, especially in remote areas. Even if you managed to store water, you would still face the constant worry of dry spells or flash floods that could leave your resources depleted. You might have started with a well, but it could dry up in a matter of months, leaving you scrambling to find another source. There were no convenient rivers running through most homesteads. In fact, many settlers in the desert or arid regions had to rely on the rain itself. They would use rain barrels to collect water, but these could only hold so much, and the water wasn't always clean or safe to drink. The scarcity of water was an ever-present danger. Hunting and foraging for food was just as unpredictable as securing water. Moreover, preserving food was another constant concern. Without modern refrigeration or canning, settlers had to find ways to keep their meat from spoiling. If food was scarce, your reliance on fire became even more pronounced. Firewood was essential, not just for warmth, but for cooking and boiling water. These essentials, water and fire, were the difference between life and death in the Wild West. Yet, they were not always easily obtained or maintained. At times, you might wonder how much longer you could endure such uncertainty. As the seasons change, the demands on the essential resources of water, food, and fire become even more apparent. The early optimism that comes with starting a new life on the frontier gives way to the reality that survival here is not just about hard work, it's about constantly managing and protecting these crucial elements. Water management, the heart of survival. Water, the most fundamental resource, remains a constant challenge throughout the year. Sometimes the work pays off, but often the water level drops just when you need it most. Contaminated water is another unseen threat. Without the luxury of modern filtration systems, you must boil the water to make it safe. But that requires fire, another resource that can be scarce. A single slip-up in this process could lead to illness, and if a disease like cholera or typhoid fever strikes, it can decimate your small homestead in days. While hunting and gathering might provide some relief, they are never reliable. Without refrigeration, you're forced to salt, dry, or smoke your food to keep it from spoiling. Crops, once planted, are at the mercy of weather and pests. Without the technology to irrigate or control soil quality, your crops are often left vulnerable to drought, hail, or even the devastating damage caused by locust swarms. The earth, while fertile in some areas, is often unpredictably, especially when it comes to crops like corn, wheat, or potatoes that need a specific amount of water and consistent conditions to thrive. A single miscalculation, whether you plant too early or the rains don't come, could mean the difference between a bountiful harvest and a failed season. Wolves, mountain lions, and even bears roamed the frontier, and without a fire to protect your livestock, they could be picked off in the dead of night. Fire was both your greatest ally and your most dangerous foe, a duality that settlers had to navigate each day. A shortage in any one of these could lead to disaster. Every day required careful management of resources, and every decision had weight. Planning ahead was critical, but even the best plans could fail due to a lack of resources, unforeseen weather, or natural disasters. The balance between work and resource management was delicate, and settlers had to constantly adapt to the changing conditions around them. These methods take time, energy, and constant attention. You can't afford to waste a single piece of meat. In some places, game can be so scarce that even a successful hunt still doesn't provide enough to see you through a full season. Life on the frontier wasn't about grand adventures or striking it rich. It was about survival. Plain and simple. Every day was a test of how well you could manage the basics, how well you could make do with what you had. And in the Wild West, it wasn't the strongest or the most prepared who always survived. It was those who could adapt, who could make the most of what was available to them. At times, you turned to foraging, collecting wild berries, roots, and edible plants to supplement your diet. But even these come with risks. Mistaking a poisonous plant for something edible could cost you dearly. Wildlife such as deer, bison, and rabbits are often difficult to track or not present in your area. Hunting itself requires skill, patience, and the right equipment, which might be in short supply. Your rifle, while crucial, can break or fail at the worst possible moment. Fire isn't just a tool, it's an absolute necessity in the Wild West. Without it, there's no cooking, no warmth, and no way to sterilize water. In the winter, the cold can be deadly, and without fire, your shelter becomes nothing more than a cold, empty box. Nighttime temperatures in the mountains or desert can plunge far below freezing, and without fire, you risk hypothermia. Keeping the fire going in the face of strong winds or rain becomes another full-time job. You're often left to rely on traps or poison, methods that require precision and a great deal of time to set up. Wildfires, sparked by a single careless spark, can quickly turn into an uncontrollable force of nature. The dry, cracked earth is a perfect tinderbox, and if a wildfire sweeps through, it can wipe out homes, livestock, and crops in an instant. The risk of fire is always present, especially during dry seasons, when winds pick up and the brush is at its driest. During the spring and fall, when the rains might provide some relief, the water supply is still unpredictable. You find yourself relying on creeks, cisterns, and streams, all of which are often fragile. The unsung reality of frontier life is that your access to water is never guaranteed, and many settlers never anticipated how quickly their world could change when the rains don't come. Floods can destroy crops, drown livestock, and wash away homes. You learn to harness the water you can. Rainwater harvesting becomes a vital skill, and if you're fortunate enough to find a well or a nearby river, it can mean the difference between survival and death. But even then, overuse or drought can turn a once plentiful source into a dangerous liability. You spend countless hours digging, trying to find that elusive well or spring that can sustain you through the summer. Without water, crops wither, animals die, and your livelihood crumbles. Food. The struggle to feed yourself and your family. Food becomes a critical concern. And even if you are successful in hunting, the preservation of meat is another matter entirely. Farming offers some reprieve, but presents its own set of challenges. Fire, a necessity, yet a threat. Then there's fire. However, fire comes with its own set of dangers. Fire was essential for cooking and boiling water, but it was also vital for keeping predators at bay. A cycle of reliance. These three essentials, water, food, and fire, were the cornerstones of survival. In a world that offered no guarantees, settlers had to find innovative solutions and rely on their resourcefulness to get by. As time stretches on in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the Wild West, the constant need to secure water, food, and fire becomes a deeply ingrained part of daily life. No matter how much you prepare, these essentials are never guaranteed, and the uncertainty that comes with that lack of guarantee never fades. You've worked tirelessly to ensure that your wells are deep enough, your rain barrels are full, and your irrigation systems, however rudimentary, are functioning. Sometimes, in the dry months of summer, you'll ration water. Even for bathing or washing, a splash of rain is welcomed, but it's rarely enough to sustain you for long. Winter months present their own difficulties. While rain might be more frequent, freezing temperatures could make the collection and storage of water a dangerous task. While your corn may be growing strong and your potatoes are looking promising, the truth of the matter is that your food security is still far from guaranteed. In the early spring, you're vulnerable to frosts that could destroy weeks of hard work in a single night. You rely on wild game, but that too is fraught with difficulty. Wild animals don't always cooperate, and some seasons produce better hunts than others. Rabbits and deer may be plentiful, but only if you can find the right hunting grounds. The hunt itself takes time and patience, often leaving you exhausted and frustrated when a successful catch is hard to come by. And even when you do succeed, the preservation of meat remains a concern. Canning and smoking can help, but without a reliable source of salt and cool storage, the meat quickly spoils. Without the ability to instantly protect crops from the harsh climate, the risk of losing them to weather becomes a constant threat. Each year, droughts, hailstorms, and pests present unpredictable dangers to the future of your crops. You've learned to carry extra containers of water wherever you go, making sure to always have a reserve in case you'll be forced to travel or your well fails. The soil is dry and sometimes difficult to manage, but you've learned to make do with what you have. Pests, too, are always lurking, ready to attack your wheat or corn just as they ripen. Even in the best conditions, raising animals on the frontier is never easy. They need constant care, and when they fall ill, you have to rely on your own knowledge or a local vet if you can find one. Outbreaks of disease can wipe out entire herds, leaving you without meat, leather, or milk to sustain your family. On top of that, you must be ever vigilant against the threat of predators. Mountain lions and bears are always a potential threat to your livestock, especially during winter when they're desperate for food. In the early days of spring, locusts might swarm and strip entire fields bare. There are traps and natural deterrents you can try, but you've learned that you can never rely on anything but constant vigilance to protect what you have. Even so, you never know when disaster might strike. A well could suddenly run dry, a creek could shift its course, or a spring that has sustained you for months could become contaminated. There's an inescapable pressure to manage every drop of water you have, always thinking ahead. Water isn't just for drinking. Without it, there is no crop to grow, no livestock to raise, and no vegetation to forage. Your food supply becomes entirely dependent on your water supply. Settlers must adapt continually, knowing that the next season or storm could change everything. With each passing year, you find yourself more resilient, more aware of the fragility of your existence, and increasingly focused on survival. The uncertainty around it makes each day feel like you're treading on fragile ground, and it's the one thing that always keeps you on edge. Neighboring settlers often trade water rights or share sources, but even then, those relationships are strained. One bad year of drought could lead to conflict, where a shortage of water leads to disputes over rights and ownership. These tensions simmer just beneath the surface, and though there's often a sense of community, the battle for water is a constant reminder that survival comes with its sacrifices. Water, the elusive lifeline by now. You've learned that water isn't just a commodity, it is the lifeblood of your entire existence. On top of daily usage, you also have to make sure you've stored enough water to survive dry spells. Despite all the planning, water scarcity remains your greatest concern. Food, the lifeblood of your family's well-being as crops become established. You have a sense of security, but it's an illusion. You spend hours each day in the field, ensuring that the crops are watered, tended, and protected from threats. Yet hunting continues to be a critical supplement to your food supply. Your livestock plays a major role in your food supply. Cattle, sheep, chickens, and pigs all need water and food to survive. Despite these challenges, your understanding of self-sufficiency grows. You've become a master of making do with limited resources. Canning fruits, preserving meats, and drying herbs all become critical skills to keep your food supply from running out. You know that hunting will not always be available, and farming is a gamble. But learning how to preserve whatever food you can find ensures that your family will have something to eat when the next disaster strikes, even if it is only the dried beans or the salted meat from last season's harvest. The land, though full of potential, never offers an easy existence. These resources are the cornerstones of your survival, and you quickly realize that without them, everything you've worked for, your home, your family, and your future is at risk. Fire. Keeping warm and safe no matter the season, fire remains an essential. Without it, you cannot cook, you cannot stay warm, and you cannot boil water to make it drinkable. Fire, though, is not easily controlled, especially in the dry climates of the Wild West. Even the smallest spark can cause a wildfire, destroying homes, livestock, and entire fields. The balance between using fire and avoiding disaster is a fine line. You've learned the proper techniques to maintain a fire without risking disaster, and you know where to gather the best firewood. The forests of the West, though beautiful, can also become dangerous when fire spreads quickly, and you never know when a wildfire might start due to the dry conditions. But when it works, fire is your greatest ally. The warmth it provides during the freezing winter nights is essential, and it serves as the center of your cooking and heating needs. The weather dictates your ability to gather firewood, and with the increase in droughts, even finding wood becomes an ongoing challenge. Fire itself is both a source of life and a constant risk that must be handled with great care. Without it, survival becomes impossible. You know that keeping a fire burning is not just for comfort, it's for survival. But this comes with a constant effort. Finding dry wood, maintaining a steady flame, and ensuring that you never let the fire go out. Even in the summer, when it's unbearably hot, fire plays a crucial role in preserving meat, boiling water, and cooking food. However, when the seasons change, you find yourself constantly adjusting your routines. The struggle for water, food, and fire continues to shape every day of life in the Wild West. In the vast, open expanses of the Wild West, survival wasn't just about overcoming the land or finding the necessary resources to live. It was about surviving nature itself. The weather, more than anything else, was an unpredictable and dangerous force, capable of both sustaining and destroying life in the same breath. The weather systems in the Wild West were unpredictable and often extreme. One day could be scorching and dry. The next could bring relentless storms or blizzards. There were floods that could wipe out crops and livestock, followed by dry seasons that would leave you desperate for water. Snowstorms, which seemed almost out of place in a land known for its heat, and damaged buildings often, with no way to recover what was lost. Without enough shelter or resources, you were forced to start over from scratch. Some settlers found that after a devastating flood, they had no choice but to abandon their homes, their livelihoods destroyed by forces beyond their control. and dust could trap settlers in their homes for weeks, while tornadoes could wipe entire towns off the map in a matter of minutes. Snow blindness, frostbite, and hypothermia were real threats, and if you weren't properly prepared, if you ran out of supplies, the cold could overwhelm you in an instant. Even the most prepared settlers, with their warm homes and plentiful firewood, were vulnerable to the power of a snowstorm. The isolation that settlers experienced was amplified by the winter weather, leaving many families feeling like they were trapped by their circumstances. In the plains and prairies, where flat land stretched as far as the eye could see, tornadoes were a very real and very deadly threat. Unlike the snowstorms or floods, which could at least give you time to prepare, tornadoes were sudden and violent. At the first sign of dark clouds or shifting winds, families would run to storm shelters or hide in their basements, but not every home had a basement, and not every homestead had a safe haven from these terrifying storms. Settlers often sought refuge in storm pits or makeshift shelters, praying that they would survive the storm intact. As a settler, you learn that survival requires more than just perseverance. It requires a deep connection with the land, a respect for its power, and the resilience to face the challenges it brings. Season after season, the immense winds could destroy everything in their path. Homes, barns, livestock, and crops were torn apart in minutes. Whether you are battling floods, snowstorms, or tornadoes, nature showed no mercy. The constant struggle against these elements tested the limits of human endurance, forcing settlers to adapt, improvise, and endure. If you didn't see the tornado coming, you wouldn't have time to escape or protect yourself. The land, though seemingly full of promise, could just as easily turn into an enemy, sweeping away everything you had worked for. The sheer speed and force of these storms were enough to tear buildings from their foundations. It wasn't uncommon for entire towns to be wiped off the map after a tornado hit, leaving only debris and destruction behind. Settlers learned to be constantly vigilant, watching the skies for signs of impending storms. But even with this awareness, tornadoes could strike with terrifying unpredictability. Farmers would build levees to protect their land, but nature often found a way around these human efforts. While the Wild West is known for its heat, the mountainous regions and northern plains were notorious for brutal winter storms. For many settlers, especially those living in remote areas, snowstorms were not just an inconvenience. They were a threat to survival. The bitter cold, combined with heavy snow, could trap entire families inside their homes for weeks at a time. With no way to leave or gather supplies, you could easily find yourself starving or without firewood in a matter of days. Every day, settlers faced the possibility that the weather would turn against them, and when it did, the consequences could be devastating. When you arrived, there was excitement and a sense of new beginnings, but weather-related disasters soon reminded you that the land didn't care about your plans or dreams. In areas with limited resources, you would need to ration food, firewood, and water, and pray that the storms didn't last too long. Even simple tasks like checking livestock or repairing fences became incredibly difficult when snow buried everything beneath it. In mountainous regions, even natural landmarks became hard to recognize as snowdrifts changed the landscape. No matter how hard you worked, nature could undo it all in an instant. Tornadoes, hailstorms, floods, and snowstorms were as much a part of the landscape as the cactus and mountains, and they would test your resilience at every turn. The land itself, whether it was the barren desert, the prairies, or the mountains, was at the mercy of a volatile climate. In the early days of settling, it was easy to underestimate the power of the weather. Floods. The sudden destruction. Flooding was one of the most sudden and devastating weather events in the Wild West. Rivers that seemed reliable could quickly turn into roaring torrents during spring thaw or unexpected rainstorms, overwhelming the land with swift force. If you lived near a riverbed, you knew all too well that the land could transform in a matter of hours. Heavy rains would swell the rivers, turning your fields, crops, and livestock into nothing more than debris. In places like the plains, where the soil was often sandy and unable to retain water. A simple downpour could create flash floods, carrying away everything in its path. The aftermath of a flood was brutal. Once the water receded, you'd be left with destroyed crops, drowned livestock. The worst part about floods was their unpredictability. You could be on the verge of a prosperous season, only for the weather to shift unexpectedly. Snowstorms. The silent killer. As winter approached, the threat of snowstorms became an ever-present reality for settlers. If you were unfortunate enough to be caught in a blizzard while traveling, survival became a test of resourcefulness and luck. The long winter months were spent in a constant state of vigilance, where every trip outside the shelter required careful planning. Tornadoes. The savage power of nature. Tornadoes were another ferocious weather phenomenon that settlers had to contend with. While settlers tried to build strong shelters, there was little that could be done to withstand the power of a tornado. The fear of a tornado became ingrained in daily life. The weather in the Wild West, unpredictable and unstoppable, proved to be as much an adversary as the land itself. You realize that survival isn't just about hard work, it's about the ability to weather the unpredictable storms of nature itself, to accept that the land that offers freedom is also capable of destruction in the blink of an eye. The dangers of the Wild West were never only about the visible threats like outlaws, wild animals, or unsettled lands. The real challenges were often invisible, hidden in the unpredictable weather that could change in an instant. Once the settlers realized that nature was just as deadly, if not more so, than anything they faced on the frontier, they began to adapt. Rivers, often seen as lifelines for settlers, could turn into violent torrents at the slightest change in weather. A few days of heavy rain could lead to the swelling of rivers and flash floods. Settlers knew that living near rivers or streams meant they were at risk of being washed away by the next big storm. Even a small rainstorm could signal danger in regions where the soil could not absorb water fast enough. Settlers would often wait in fear, watching the skies for dark clouds, knowing that the next rainfall could change everything. The same river that offered drinking water and irrigation for crops could, within hours, become a destructive force. But no amount of preparation could make them immune to the unforgiving forces of nature that would continue to shape their lives in unexpected ways. In the mountains and northern plains, where snow could fall for days without stopping, settlers found themselves trapped inside their homes with limited food and firewood. The long, dark months of snowstorms and freezing temperatures often led to depression and despair, especially when you were unsure if the snow would ever stop. As the cold settled in, many settlers began to wonder if it was worth the fight, questioning whether the land was even worth the struggle it took to survive it. They would huddle together in their homes, hoping their firewood supply would last, knowing that help was unreachable until the storm passed. Roofs could collapse under the weight of the snow, and walls could crack under the constant freezing and thawing. Tornadoes are ferocious and fast-moving, and their ability to destroy entire towns in minutes made them an ever-present threat. The flat, open land of the West provided little in the way of shelter, making these storms even more terrifying. Settlers didn't always have the time to prepare. The sky could turn dark. With a few minutes' notice, it could sustain you, or it could take everything away in the blink of an eye. The constant battle against floods, snowstorms, and tornadoes shaped settlers' lives, teaching them that nature could never be tamed, it could only be endured. Survival meant constantly adapting, never letting your guard down, and finding a way to carry on, no matter the storm. And by the time the tornado arrived, there was no way to escape. The long winters of the Wild West tested the endurance of both the body and mind. Even if a settler managed to survive, their homestead would be reduced to rubble, leaving them without shelter, food, or anything they had worked so hard to build. Unlike floods or snowstorms, which gave some time to prepare, tornadoes arrived with little notice and left few survivors in their wake. The mental toll of knowing that such storms could wipe out everything you had worked for added an ever-present layer of anxiety. Every dark cloud or gust of wind was a reminder that no matter how much you tried to prepare, nature could destroy it all in an instant. Entire families were sometimes wiped out, and even those who survived had to rebuild from the ground up. For the children, The endless days of snow and cold meant being stuck indoors for weeks at a time, with little entertainment or distraction from the dreariness of winter life. Families without enough firewood or warm clothing could find themselves in serious danger. Hunting was made impossible by the snow, and with the crops buried under layers of ice, there was no food to fall back on. The feeling of being trapped, no communication with the outside world, no ability to get supplies, and no way to even keep warm was a terrifying reality for many. The snowstorms would arrive with little warning, blanketing the landscape in a thick layer of white. The cold was brutal, and the wind could whip the snow into a blinding frenzy, making it impossible to even step outside without risking frostbite or hypothermia. But once the rains came, it was a gamble. Some homesteads were established where water was scarce, but those spots didn't always provide the fertility of riverbanks. The desire to establish a thriving farm often outweighed the knowledge that floods were a common risk, and once a flood hit, there was little that could be done. Without the ability to call for help or escape quickly, a severe flood often marked the end of the homestead. Many families were left with no choice but to rebuild in another location or give up altogether. The swift currents could overwhelm levees and floodplains, sweeping away entire settlements in their path. Once the floodwaters receded, all that remained was muddy debris, drowned animals, and ruined crops, a devastating loss that could mean the difference between another year of survival or being forced to abandon everything and start anew. Floods, the devastating impact of uncontrolled waters. The Wild West's landscape might have seemed dry and desolate in many areas, but flooding was a serious concern. In many cases, settlers built their homes and farms near rivers, relying on the fertile soil for crops and livestock. Despite these dangers, settlers didn't always have the luxury of moving further inland. The unpredictability of these floods made them one of the greatest environmental challenges faced by settlers. Snowstorms. The cold's silent grip when winter arrived. The snowstorms that swept across the Wild West were just as dangerous as the floods, if not more so. In the midst of a snowstorm, settlers found themselves struggling with isolation. Even the strongest homes, built to withstand the harsh conditions of the frontier, could not guarantee safety. The mental toll of winter isolation could be just as severe as the physical hardships. Tornadoes, nature's fury on the plains. The most violent of nature's forces were the tornadoes, which were common in the plains and prairie regions. Tornadoes could strike with devastating speed, tearing apart houses, barns, crops, and livestock. These storms left behind nothing but destruction. Because of the lack of proper warning systems, tornadoes were often met with helplessness. The unpredictable weather of the Wild West was as much a part of life as the land itself. After the floods, the snowstorms, and the tornadoes, the settlers of the Wild West learned that survival was as much about enduring the forces of nature as it was about building a home and raising crops. With every disaster, they adapted, becoming more resilient to the unpredictable weather. But that resilience came at a price, one that often pushed them to their physical and emotional limits, adapting to the uncertainty. As the seasons passed, settlers learned to anticipate the changing weather, if only to prepare for the worst. You would begin to notice patterns, small shifts in the weather that might signal an incoming storm, or a change in wind direction that could mean a tornado was near. But no matter how many signs you learned to read, the Wild West was never predictable. A storm might be mild one year, but the next, it could wipe out everything you've worked for. In a matter of hours, they would rebuild their homes. But it could take weeks or even months to recover from the damage. And yet, for settlers, it was an ongoing process, always hopeful, always ready to face the next challenge. No matter how difficult, rebuilding didn't just mean repairing fences and houses. It also meant trying to revive the land. During winter, when the days were short and the cold was brutal, settlers could find themselves trapped in their homes for weeks. Without the ability to travel, settlers could be left without fresh food or water, and with limited firewood, they were often left to ration what little they had. They stockpiled food during the warmer months, knowing they'd need it when storms struck. They relied on community, when possible, to share resources and support each other through the tough months. They often appeared on the horizon with little more than a darkened sky or twisted clouds in the distance. And within minutes, they could decimate everything in their path. Tornadoes were often accompanied by hailstorms, which could also destroy crops, break windows, and damage livestock. While blizzards might give you time to prepare, or floods might be anticipated if you were near a river, tornadoes often left no time for action. It wasn't just the property damage or the loss of livestock, it was the human toll. They didn't necessarily defeat the weather, but they adapted to it. They became experts in weather patterns, farming techniques, and shelter building. The weather could destroy everything, but it couldn't break the settler's spirit. They were battered by floods, snowstorms, and tornadoes. But each time they rebuilt, they learned that the Wild West was not about conquering nature, it was about enduring it. They became resilient not because they were invincible, but because they had to be. Resilience was not an option, it was the only way to survive. Tornadoes could kill entire families and leave survivors with nothing but destruction and grief. But in the Wild West, survivors had no choice but to rebuild again and again in the face of unforgiving weather. Even the sturdiest shelters made from logs or stone could not always withstand a tornado's winds. Storm cellars or underground bunkers were often the only refuge, but these were few and far between, especially in the more isolated areas. Winds could exceed 200 miles per hour, making it impossible to protect yourself. Entire villages could be wiped out in mere minutes, and you would have no warning of where the tornado would strike next. Some groups of settlers built snow shelters or dug out paths to other homes, but even the most resilient people were still at the mercy of the storms. The lack of social interaction in the dead of winter added to the mental strain, with many settlers going through the long nights in solitude, or with only their families. They accepted that every year could bring new challenges, but they also learned to celebrate the victories when the crops grew, when the storm passed, when the animals were safe, and when they could go another year alive. The isolation during these storms was debilitating, leading to feelings of loneliness and despair. The constant fight for survival made every day feel like an uphill battle. The cold was often relentless, with sub-zero temperatures making it impossible to work outside for any long period of time. The weight of snow could collapse roofs, and the lack of proper insulation in many homes meant that frostbite and hypothermia were real dangers. Often, that would involve replanting crops or finding new sources of water. The mental toll of living with this uncertainty was heavy. You couldn't plan beyond the immediate future because so much of your survival relied on the weather's whims. But over time, you learned how to deal with it. You learned that your livelihood wasn't just based on planting crops or raising livestock. It was based on your ability to adapt. Fields that had once been lush with crops were now drenched, and crops that had been close to harvest could be entirely destroyed. The water damage would often leave soil too wet or salty, rendering it unusable for months. Buildings that were not built on raised ground would be saturated and may collapse in the aftermath. To weather the storms as best as you could, and to rebuild when the inevitable destruction occurred. A rainstorm could ruin your crops, or a tornado could destroy everything you owned. Even the safest seasons, the summer heat or the calm fall months, came with their own threats. Whether it was a drought or locusts, as a settler, you couldn't rely on predictability. The weather would always keep you guessing. Floods and the recovery process after a flood. When the rains subsided and the waters eventually receded, the damage would be immediate and obvious. The immediate aftermath was a time of despair. Settlers would find themselves with little to no food or supplies, forced to make do with what they had left. This was a pattern that would repeat itself. Recovery, followed by renewed hope, and then the inevitable fear that nature's wrath could strike again. Snowstorms. Enduring the isolation, snowstorms, too, had their way of creating chaos. But what was worse than the cold was the isolation that snowstorms brought. But even in the most severe winters, settlers found ways to adapt. Tornadoes, the ever-present threat of all the weather threats. Tornadoes were perhaps the most terrifying because of their sudden, violent nature. Tornadoes did not give you much time to prepare. For many settlers, Tornadoes were a constant fear. The fear of tornadoes was always lurking, and the unpredictability of these storms was what made them so deadly. Enduring the storms through all of this, settlers learned to endure. They learned how to live with uncertainty, accepting that the weather would always be an unpredictable factor in their lives. In the end, it wasn't just the weather that defined life in the Wild West. Was the ability to survive it. The gold rush that swept across the Wild West in the mid-1800s wasn't just an exciting time of prosperity and discovery. It was also an era of intense hardship, struggle, and moral compromise. The promise of striking it rich in a booming gold town lured tens of thousands of people to the western frontier. The streets were lined with tents, makeshift shacks, and saloons. The air was thick with the hustle of miners, traders, gamblers, and hopefuls from all walks of life, each seeking their fortune. The town seemed to pulse with energy, and hope hung in the air, as thick as the dust that coated everything. Everyone was on edge, yet the dream of striking gold made it feel like anything was possible. Thieves, gamblers, and outlaws often roamed freely, taking advantage of the chaotic environment. Trust was a rare commodity in boomtowns. Everyone was out for themselves, and friendships often turned into rivalries. The gold fever made people act outside of their moral code, and it wasn't unusual for men to abandon their families or cheat others to get ahead. The wild nature of the gold rush towns meant that every interaction was underlined with a sense of danger. From the moment you woke up to the moment you fell asleep, gambling was a favorite pastime for many, and it often went hand in hand with cheating and fraud. Miners and their families arrived in droves, but as soon as the gold ran out or living conditions became unbearable, many would pack up and leave. A boomtown could rise quickly, but it could also fall into decay just as fast. Families uprooted their lives in search of a new beginning, but they were often met with disappointment and misfortune. The uncertainty of when or even if that day would come created a deep strain on families. The idea of an idyllic childhood was rare in these towns, and many children learned to survive on their own at an early age. The boomtowns were filled with dreams of wealth, but they also housed some of the most difficult and unforgiving lives in the Wild West. Settlers arrived with the hope of building something better, but most left broken, their lives and fortunes shattered by the relentless grind of survival. Education was often a luxury in boomtowns, as schools were few and far between. Instead of classrooms, children would often help in the mines, assist in running errands, or work in saloons or stores just like the adults. The constant pressure to survive, coupled with a lack of proper resources and the dangers of the environment, left little room for the joys of childhood. Women often found themselves alone, raising children without the support of their husbands. And when men did return, they often brought back nothing but disease, loss, and poverty. Many wives had to survive on their own, living in the makeshift homes of boom, where even the basic necessities like food, water, and shelter were constantly at risk. It was common for men to leave their families behind and travel alone, drawn by the hope of striking it rich. Many promised to come back and bring their families to share in their newfound wealth. But for most, the reality was far different. Once the gold was gone or too hard to find, the town would be abandoned, leaving only empty homes and broken dreams. In the lawless atmosphere, you had to constantly be on guard. The influx of settlers meant that the demand for housing skyrocketed, but the supply of materials was limited. Most miners ended up living in tents, makeshift shacks, or even dilapidated buildings that were barely standing. The dust from mining would coat everything, and the air was thick with dirt. There were few sanitary facilities, and with the growing population came the spread of disease. The lack of proper plumbing, the overpopulation, and the unsanitary conditions led to frequent outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and other deadly diseases. Many settlers would come to boomtowns hoping for fortune, but would die from disease before they ever saw a gold nugget. Those who were seen as too soft or unable to defend themselves were often victimized or forced to leave town. Water, for instance, was often scarce. The mining process required large amounts of water, but most towns were built far from reliable water sources. Those who lived in boomtowns were often forced to make do with dirty, contaminated water or had to haul water from distant rivers, sometimes miles away. Without fresh food and clean water, settlers became more susceptible to disease and malnutrition. Some sought fortune, others adventure, and still others simply a fresh start. But behind the allure of gold and easy wealth lay a much darker reality. As a miner in a boomtown, life was far from the glamour depicted in newspapers or stories passed from person to person. These towns, often established in remote areas far from any established civilization, were teeming with lawlessness, violence, and extreme living conditions. The initial rush for gold created a sense of community, but it was a fragile and fleeting one. Someone would shout, "Rich veins of gold waiting to be found," and for some, that was enough to push them deeper into the madness. But as you quickly learned, the reality of life in a boomtown wasn't as simple as finding gold and living happily ever after. For many, the journey to the gold fields meant physical and mental exhaustion, poverty, and the loss of everything they had back home. When you first arrived in a boomtown, it was easy to be caught up in the excitement. You'd be greeted with the promise of wealth. The next strike is just over the hill. Sheriffs and lawmen were often outnumbered, and in many towns, there were simply no official authorities to keep the peace. The desperation for gold-fueled violence, disputes over claims, thefts, and gambling debts often turned into fights, sometimes ending in death. If someone crossed you, there was little chance of justice. Vigilante justice became common, and duels in the streets were seen as a quick resolution to conflicts. Violence and lawlessness. A town without rules. One of the most immediate challenges in a boomtown was the lack of law and order. The lack of law enforcement also meant that the criminal element could flourish. Living in such an environment could break even the strongest individuals. Harsh living conditions. Survival was never guaranteed in a boomtown. The living conditions were among the harshest imaginable. The harsh living conditions were also worsened by the lack of resources. As a result, the population of boomtowns was often very unstable. The toll on families. The price of fortune for many settlers. The gold rush wasn't just a way to get rich. It was a chance for a better life. Wives and children were left behind, either to fend for themselves or to join the men once the gold was found. Children born in boomtowns grew up amidst violence, instability, and uncertainty. The gold rush promised riches and prosperity, but for most, it delivered nothing but hardship, suffering, and disillusionment. The gold rush brought thousands of people to the Wild West, each driven by the promise of instant wealth. Yet, as the booming towns expanded, the darker side of the rush began to show. The boomtowns that sprang up like wildfire were full of hope, but they were also full of unforeseen consequences, violence, disease, and economic instability that most had never expected. But the reality of living in a gold rush town meant facing the harsh truth that wealth was fleeting and often beyond your control. For some, gold could be found quickly, but for most, it took weeks, months, or even years of hard labor to find any meaningful amount. Even then, there was no guarantee the gold would last. In many cases, it wasn't the miners who struck it rich, but the ones who sold goods, ran saloons, or provided services to those living in the boomtown. The unpredictable nature of wealth in some towns. The lack of law enforcement meant that outlaws found it easy to make their living by robbing miners, taking their earnings, and leaving behind nothing but grief. The promise of quick riches was too tempting, and many miners found themselves in debt that they couldn't repay. Some would gamble away all their gold in one night, only to return to their claims empty-handed the next day. It wasn't unusual for miners to turn to crime or even theft to settle debts, or to try to gain back their lost fortune. The dark side of gold was its corrupting influence on both the miners and those who tried to profit from their labor. Mining was a dangerous occupation in and of itself. The risk of cavines, explosions, and accidents from heavy equipment made every day in the mines a fight for survival. In the early days of the gold rush, miners were often unskilled and didn't know the dangers of working in a mine, which increased the likelihood of fatal accidents. The anarchy of a boomtown also led to the rise of powerful gangs or vigilantes, which either protected the people or terrorized them, depending on which side you were on. Riches were found, but they were few and far between. For the majority of settlers, the dream of gold never materialized. The tale of the gold rush isn't just one of riches, but of loss, betrayal, and the inevitable decay that came when a town lived and died on the promise of something as volatile as gold. And for most, the gold rush was an experience that left them with more questions than answers. Was it worth it? Was the cost of fortune too high? Could it ever have been worth the sacrifice? Many would return home, poorer than they came, their bodies worn out by the grind of mining and their spirits broken by the struggle. And, of course, many miners ended up losing everything they had invested, only to find themselves stranded in a boomtown without any means to return home. The newfound wealth often led to isolation, paranoia, and a breakdown of personal relationships. It was easy to trust no one when everyone around you was driven by greed. Those who made their fortune often spent it just as quickly, squandering it on gambling, alcohol, or unsustainable lifestyles, until they, too, were back to square one. Gold was easy come, easy go. You could find it one day, only to see it slip through your fingers the next. The more miners crowded into the camps, the more competition grew. Sanitary conditions in the towns were appalling. Sewage ran in the streets, and the drinking water was often contaminated by runoff from the mining processes. Disease could spread rapidly, and it was indeed unusual for entire families to be wiped out by illness before they ever saw a return on their investment in the gold fields. Fights over claims, theft, and violence became more common. The distrust between miners and other settlers ran deep. The boomtowns, due to their rapid growth and lack of planning, became hotbeds for disease. Sanitation was poor, and the crowded living conditions made it easy for diseases like cholera, typhoid, and smallpox to spread in such an environment. Morality often gave way to survival, and people would do whatever it took to secure their future. Miners could lose everything to poor decisions, or worse, to the greed that ran rampant. They spent their gold just as quickly as they found it, pouring their earnings into alcohol, gambling, or the growing brothel industry that was born from the chaos of a town without rules. The hope of striking it rich wasn't just about finding gold. It was about the promise of a new life. The vast wealth that had drawn so many to the mining camps was also the very thing that corrupted them. As the gold became harder to find, the miners' hopes of striking it rich began to fade. Corruption and lawlessness. The dark heart of boomtowns. A boomtown, as quickly as it rose, could fall just as rapidly. With no formal infrastructure or government in place, these towns became breeding grounds for lawlessness. There were no rules, no police force, and certainly no one to hold people accountable for their actions. What you saw on the surface excited miners, shiny gold veins, and promises of wealth was often just a cover for the chaos that thrived underneath. In these lawless towns, violence was commonplace. Fistfights and gunfights were frequent, sometimes over gold claims, sometimes over insults, or simply out of frustration and desperation. Gambling was a huge part of boomtown life. Saloon keepers, who often doubled as gamblers, made a fortune off the desperation of miners trying to hit it big. Death and disease. The cost of living in a boomtown, while gold might have been the primary attraction for settlers, disease and death were the grim realities of life in the Wild West. Without proper medical care or resources, settlers were often left to suffer and die in a place that promised wealth but provided little in terms of health and well-being. Even those who weren't sick faced the constant threat of violent death. In some towns, as the population increased, crime surged. Murders, robberies, and assaults were rampant as people fought to survive and protect their minds. The false promise of wealth. Ultimately, the gold rush didn't bring wealth to everyone, and for many, it left nothing but heartache and poverty. For the lucky few who did strike it rich, life in a boomtown was not much better. The boomtowns were a microcosm of the American dream, full of hope and possibility. But ultimately, a hard lesson in the cost of wealth. As the years went on, the boom towns of the Wild West began to fade into history. What once thrived with the promise of gold and the dream of riches slowly turned into ghost towns, their streets empty and their buildings falling apart. The gold rush had created communities that were born out of hope, but it was that very hope that led to their destruction. The cost of that fleeting wealth wasn't just monetary, it was personal, emotional, and spiritual. The cycle of boom and bust for many. The boomtown experience followed a familiar pattern. Prosperity quickly, followed by a sudden collapse. The excitement of finding gold, the rush of success, would eventually give way to competition, greed, and the harsh realities of mining. Miners, prospectors, and entrepreneurs packed up and moved on in search of new opportunities. For the miners who had survived and returned to their former homes, the gold rush was a painful memory at time, when their lives had been shaped by a dream that never quite materialized. These once thriving places were now reminders of what the gold rush had taken from the land and its people. The gold, once a symbol of hope and wealth, was now buried under layers of dirt and time. Just as the dreams of the miners were buried with them, what remained were the empty streets and decaying buildings that once bustled with life. Those who remained in the region found themselves haunted by the memory of better times. It wasn't just the wealth they lost, it was the toll it took on their families, their health, and their spirits. How the pursuit of wealth can tear apart communities, and how the search for gold often costs more than it's worth. The boomtowns, though abandoned, still stand as a reminder of the true cost of the rush, what people were willing to sacrifice in the hope of fortune and the toll it took when that fortune was never realized. In many ways, the wild excitement of the gold rush left people with more questions than answers, and a deep realization that wealth, when sought without caution, could be as much a curse as a blessing. The land, while still holding remnants of gold, had left behind far more in terms of broken promises and lost potential. The boom towns, which had once promised great riches, became symbols of unfulfilled dreams and the high cost of seeking fortune in the Wild West. The hopes and dreams of those who had come seeking fortune were replaced by the cold silence of forgotten lives. As more and more people poured into the area, the gold veins that once seemed endless started to dwindle. It sparked a mass migration to the frontier and contributed to the growth of cities and railroads, but it also left behind a legacy of lost wealth, death, and disillusionment. The boomtowns that sprang up and disappeared in the blink of an eye were proof that the West was not a place of endless opportunity. It was a place where people came to compete, to survive, and to hope, but where many never made it out with the riches they had dreamed of. Once the easy-to-find gold was extracted, it became harder and harder to dig deeper, and the gold that had once flowed freely became elusive. The cost of gold wasn't just in what it took from the land, but also what it took from the people. Men who arrived with families were often forced to leave in search of better opportunities, abandoning homes and loved ones. Families who had come to build a future were sometimes left broken by the relentless nature of the mining life. In a place where survival came first, and wealth was always within reach, but just out of grasp, people changed. Relationships suffered as individuals turned from community to competition. In addition to the violence and lawlessness, many settlers found that the dream of wealth was just that, a dream. Famine, disease, and accidents claimed the lives of those who weren't able to escape the madness of the rush. For those who managed to survive, the wealth they had hoped for was often unattainable. The gold that had once shone brightly now felt like a faded memory for those who had built their hopes and futures on it. The collapse of the boomtowns was a harsh wake-up call. The end of the gold rush. Ghost towns and forgotten dreams. As the gold veins grew scarce, many boomtowns were abandoned. The landscape was littered with the ruins of towns that were once filled with excitement and prosperity, now reduced to dust. In many of the abandoned towns, the remnants of people's dreams could still be found: rusted tools, abandoned mining equipment, and empty cabins. For the few who remained, the gold rush had changed them. Some had made their fortunes, but many had lost everything in the chaos. The lasting legacy of the gold rush. The gold rush left a lasting mark on the history of the Wild West. For the people who lived through the gold rush, the cost was high. The legacy of the Wild West gold rush isn't just the history of people striking it rich. It's the story of how easily dreams can turn to dust. Life on the edge of civilization in the Wild West was defined by an absence of law, and the outlaws and gunfighters who roamed freely in the frontier towns became the stuff of legend. The wild, open spaces of the West made it difficult for any central authority to control them, and without proper law enforcement, the bandits and thieves were free to reign. Most frontier towns were little more than collections of shanties where you could settle in, mine for gold, or open a saloon. But the cost was high. With the gold rush, the population of these towns exploded, bringing not only those hoping to strike it rich. When towns were small, there was often no sheriff to act as a deterrent. In a land with few rules, they represented a certain freedom, the ability to take what you wanted, live outside the confines of society, and challenge the establishment. While some towns had attempts at maintaining a semblance of order, gunmen and bandits were seen as heroes in some quarters. There was also a prevailing sense of mistrust. Settlers couldn't fully trust the man sitting next to them at the bar, because they never knew if they were sharing a drink with an outlaw or a respected prospector. They are often remembered as romanticized, but the truth of these encounters was far more brutal. In many cases, gunfights were quick and deadly, with little to no justice afterward. The speed of the draw and the accuracy of the shot were more important than any legal process. As a settler, you often had no choice but to take matters into your own hands. When lawmen failed, or outlaws went unpunished, while it might have given some settlers a sense of security, it also created an environment where the line between justice and vengeance was often blurred. The violence, desperation, and fear of living in a lawless land shaped the lives of those who settled there. And for many, the outlaws were as much a part of the West as the mountains, rivers, and mines. In some cases, innocent men were hanged or shot simply because the vigilantes deemed them guilty. This environment of mob mentality only contributed to the growing lawlessness that defined many frontier towns. There was no court system and few lawyers to argue cases, so those who felt wronged often took up arms. In some cases, towns would organize vigilante groups to hunt down criminals or settle scores that couldn't be handled by the local authorities. These groups often acted as a substitute for justice, but their methods were often just as violent and uncontrolled as the criminals they pursued. It wasn't uncommon for a rivalry between two men to end with both men dead, their families or towns left to pick up the pieces. It was a place where identity could easily be fabricated, and the line between good and evil was often fuzzy. The low men, if they existed, often lived in constant fear of being overpowered by the outlaws, or worse, betrayed by their own townsfolk. For sheriffs, the role was both a duty and a curse trying to maintain order in a world that had little regard for the rule of law. Some turned to corruption to survive. Others became heroes or martyrs, forever remembered for their attempt to hold back the tide of lawlessness. Many settlers, especially those from rough backgrounds, saw outlaws as figures who embodied the wild spirit of the frontier. For others, though they were just a dangerous nuisance, a threat to their survival, gunslingers would often take up residence in saloons, intimidating local businesses and the law-abiding citizens alike. In some cases, a Wild West town could be overtaken by outlaws, with the threat of violence looming over everyone. The outlaws would impose their own form of order, through sheer fear, knowing that if someone stepped out of line, they would face the consequences, but also those hoping to get away from their past, whether it was a crime or just a desire for a fresh start. In the absence of formal law enforcement, settlers were left to fend for themselves, and the result was a volatile world, where violence, retribution, and lawlessness were as common as the dust storms and savage winters that marked life on the frontier. Violence was always a possibility, and the threat of an encounter with an outlaw or a group of thieves loomed large. The law was often inconsistent. Sometimes there was order in the form of a sheriff or marshal, but more often than not, vigilante justice prevailed. Shootouts weren't just a spectacle, they were a matter of survival. Life could change in an instant in these towns, in the blink of an eye. A confrontation over a stolen horse, or a business deal gone wrong, could escalate into a deadly shootout. Gunfights became a rite of passage for many in the Wild West, a way of proving courage, resolve, or simply survival. The likes of Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and Butch Cassidy became household names, not just for their skill with a gun, but for their ability to exploit the lawlessness for personal gain. These men, and many others like them, carved out names and territories in the Wild West, leaving a trail of destruction behind them. The concept of justifiable violence was deeply ingrained, and the boundaries between self-defense and murder were often blurred. In towns where lawmen were scarce or ineffective, outlaws became the true rulers. For the settlers, protection often came down to the quickest draw and the strongest will. Outlaws and their impact on frontier life. The most infamous outlaws of the time didn't just thrive on violence. They built empires in the chaos that ensued. In many boom towns, life was dictated by the outlaws' control. But what was most chilling was the fact that the outlaws were often respected and even admired by many settlers. This sense of admiration for outlaws created a tension in frontier society, gunfights, and the legacy in towns where lawlessness thrived. The inevitable gunfights between outlaws and lawmen were a part of daily life. The most famous gunfights, like the gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, became woven into the fabric of Western lore. In a time and place where survival was about staying one step ahead, a gunfight was an inevitable part of life. Vigilante justice. The unofficial law, without consistent law enforcement, vigilante justice took root in many frontier towns. Vigilante justice was a double-edged sword. In the Wild West, the outlaws and gunfights weren't just part of the landscape, they were part of the identity of the frontier itself. As the outlaws roamed freely and the gunfights became the grim reality of life in the Wild West, it wasn't just the criminals or the lawmen who shaped these communities. Ordinary men and women who came to settle on the frontier often found themselves drawn into the lawlessness, either as participants or victims. The presence of outlaws and the constant threat of violence became part of their daily lives, affecting the settlers and the survival of the fittest. But as life on the frontier was fraught with danger, survival meant constantly being on guard. Others tried to avoid conflict by staying out of the way, often building homes away from the hustle and bustle of mining towns or trading posts. But in the Wild West, even isolation offered no guarantee of peace. Outlaws would sometimes target remote areas, knowing that without law enforcement or neighbors, it was easy to intimidate or steal from vulnerable settlers. But the reality of vigilante justice was often as brutal as the lawlessness it was meant to fight. These groups might operate under the guise of righting wrongs, but in reality, they often escalated the violence and the chaos. Since there were no clear rules or boundaries, vigilantes could act on personal vendettas or prejudices. The line between justice and revenge was often blurred. Lynch mobs were notorious for taking the law into their own hands, dispensing a form of punishment that was often final and not always fair. Without a court system or a reliable police force, the people were forced to take the law into their own hands. While it could sometimes offer protection against lawless elements, it also meant that settlers were as likely to be hurt or killed by a vigilante as they were by outlaws. Most gunfighters lived in constant fear of being gunned down by a rival or an adversary with a better aim. They walked the streets of boom towns, saloons, and mines, knowing that each encounter could lead to a deadly confrontation. Whether outlaws, gunfighters, vigilantes, or just ordinary settlers trying to get by, every day on the frontier was a test of survival. In a land where rules were optional and violence could come at any moment, life on the edge meant learning to live with constant uncertainty and risk. To survive, a gunfighter needed to be quick, calm, and ruthless. The reality of this lifestyle meant that a momentary lapse and judgment or failure to read the situation correctly could end in death. And even the most famous gunfighters were not immune to this harsh reality. And he died young, either in gunfights or in violent circumstances. In this wild environment, it was difficult to determine where true justice lay. They were products of a society that placed value on strength, quickness, and the ability to survive by any means necessary. They were often forced to make decisions that blurred the lines between heroism and villainy, knowing that the best way to survive in the Wild West was to win the fight whether or not the fight was just, and whether the guilty were really being punished or if innocent men were paying the price for the anarchy of frontier life. But the real gunfighters of the West weren't always the ones seeking justice. In fact, many were just men trying to make a living in a town where the gun was often the only form of currency that truly mattered. Vigilantes would band together to track down criminals, dispense punishment, or settle scores in ways that could be every bit as violent as the crimes they were trying to stop. Gunfights, robberies, and ambushes weren't just part of the legendary Old West. They were a daily reality for many. But the truth of the gunfighter's role in frontier life was often more complex than the Hollywood portrayal of a solitary, morally conflicted hero. In reality, gunfighters were often hired guns, outlaws, or merchants of violence who made their living by settling disputes with bullets. Their actions were not always as noble as legend would have it. Every settler had to make the choice of whether they would remain passive or actively take part in this dangerous game of survival. In the Wild West, many settlers were drawn by the promise of freedom. But freedom in this case often meant living without rules. The lawlessness that defined many frontier towns wasn't just a backdrop to life, it was a fundamental part of the experience. Some settlers, in an effort to make a living, would turn to less savory means smuggling, fraud, or even partnering with outlaws to profit from the chaos. When survival depended on having enough food, water, and supplies to endure the harsh conditions, it was tempting for some to cut corners. In some cases, these opportunists found themselves caught up in the criminal underworld, becoming part of the very lawlessness they had initially sought to escape. To survive in such a world, you needed to be as tough as the land itself. Most settlers came to the frontier hoping for a better life, whether it was in farming, mining, or trading. Some decided to join forces with groups of vigilantes or self-appointed lawmen, taking matters into their own hands when the official authorities failed to protect them. The presence of lawlessness also brought out the worst instincts in people. The rise of vigilante justice, where official law was often absent. Vigilante justice became the only form of law and order in many frontier towns. Vigilante groups were often ad hoc, formed in response to a particular crime spree or outrage in the community. Vigilantism created an atmosphere of constant tension. The symbol of the gunfighter, hero or villain, in this chaotic world, the gunfighter became one of the most iconic figures of the Wild West. Men like Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and Billy the Kid became larger-than-life figures, their gunfights and confrontations immortalized in history. The gunfighter's life was dangerous. A quick draw could earn respect, but it could just as easily get you killed. What made the gunfighter's life both legendary and tragic was the fact that they were neither entirely good nor entirely bad. The lawless lands were defined by the men and women who lived on the edge of society, constantly battling the chaos and violence that came with their environment. As the days wore on and life on the frontier continued, the very fabric of society was constantly being tested in places marked by violence and lawlessness. The Wild West wasn't simply a backdrop for gunfights and outlaws. It was a place where the rules of civilization didn't always apply. Survival meant something entirely different than it did in the more settled parts of the country. In the midst of all this chaos, settlers, lawmen, and criminals alike were forced to adapt. Frontier justice, often served through the barrel of a gun, became the reality. Self-defense was a daily concern, and firearms were not just tools for hunting or protection. They were a means of asserting dominance and survival. The wildness of these places was not just defined by the presence of outlaws, but by the constant tension that existed. The fear of losing everything to the next gunfight became a driving force in the way people conducted themselves. Sheriffs like Wyatt Earp and Pat Garrett became famous not just for enforcing the law, but for navigating the very lawlessness that made their roles so difficult. Elected sheriffs often had limited power, and they could be easily undermined by the influence of local businessmen, saloon owners, or even the outlaws themselves. Many of these figures made their names not just by upholding the law, but by facing down outlaws, participating in gunfights, and engaging in ruthless tactics that would be considered unethical in more settled parts of the country. They were not simply defenders of the law, they were products of a lawless world, forced to operate within a system that valued bravery over justice. Some lowmen, in their desperation, resorted to vigilantism, taking matters into their own hands to restore order. In smaller towns, men could end up dead over a gambling debt, an insult, or even something as small as a barroom argument. The law was secondary to the fame of the fastest gun in town. Reputation was key in the Wild West, and the quickest way to establish one was to win a gunfight in. If you didn't, it could cost you everything. In a place where life and death were determined by the quickness of a draw, the Wild West was defined not just by violence, but by the human spirit's ability to survive against impossible odds. It was a place where justice was defined by the individual, and where every day could end with either fortune or death. But this approach often blurred the lines between justice and retribution, leaving the towns they protected vulnerable to their own form of chaos. They were tasked with maintaining order in towns where criminals and minors alike operated outside the constraints of traditional society. It's embedded in the very identity of the frontier. As towns grew, so did the systems of law that replaced the old ways. Yet, the violence and the notion of self-reliance that defined frontier life persisted. The West's mythology is built on the idea that individuals were left to navigate the chaotic and dangerous world without the help of the state, and this formed the essence of the American frontier spirit, one that valued freedom, toughness, and a certain moral code that could only exist in such a lawless land. In these moments, the quickest draw didn't necessarily mean just to sit, often meant survival. The gunfight at the OK Corral was a perfect example of how violence could escalate quickly. On one side, Doc Holliday and the ERPs, men who were both revered and feared for their skills with a gun. On the other side, the Clanton brothers, outlaws who thought they could keep their hold over Tombstone. In the end, the shootout wasn't just a personal conflict, it was a statement about the state of the frontier. A small dispute could easily become a deadly skirmish, and once the violence started, it could consume the town entirely. In many towns, men would walk around with their guns at their sides, ready for anything that might go wrong. In many ways, gunfights were rituals, the ultimate expression of dispute resolution in a place where there were few other options for settling scores. To survive on the frontier, you had to prove you were willing to stand your ground. Women and children, too, had to understand that survival in these conditions required both caution and strength, and living in a boomtown or mining camp meant contending with the moral ambiguities that arose when order was absent and anarchy ruled. People didn't just live next to each other, they lived on edge, fully aware that any argument could escalate into a deadly confrontation. The lack of law enforcement meant that personal disputes could quickly become life or death situations. The toll on the community. How violence shaped frontier culture in boomtowns and isolated settlements. The constant threat of violence left an indelible mark on community life. This atmosphere bred a culture of violence, where people were taught to defend themselves by any means necessary. The reputation of your town depended on its ability to handle threats, and settlers often made their decisions based on how violent or dangerous a town could become. Lowmen and their role in the Wild West. In response to this chaos, some towns appointed lowmen or sheriffs, but these figures were often as flawed and complex as the land they were tasked with protecting. However, even the best lawmen struggled against the forces of corruption and the inequity that permeated frontier life. The moral ambiguity of the Wild West was most apparent in these lawmen, who were seen by some as heroes and by others as agents of the law's failure. Gunfights, more than just violence, The gunfights that became so legendary in the Wild West weren't just displays of violence. They were a reflection of the values that defined frontier life. While stories of legendary shootouts, like the gunfight at the OK Corral, have been romanticized in books and films, the reality was much less glamorous. Most gunfights, however, weren't as monumental. The lasting legacy of violence. The legacy of violence and outlaws in the Wild West. ISNT just found in the stories of gunfight, outlaws, and lawmen. In the end, the outlaws and gunfights of the Wild West weren't just about criminals and lawmen. They were about the limits of civilization. The Wild West was not only a place of opportunity and revenge, it was also a place of danger. For settlers and travelers moving westward, the land was not always as welcoming as they had imagined. While many were drawn by the promise of land, wealth, and freedom, they were often unprepared for the constant threat of violence and war that could erupt at any time. As more and more settlers moved westward, crossing lands that were home to native tribes, tensions escalated. The clashes were frequently depicted in a manner that painted Native Americans as hostile and savage, while settlers were portrayed as victims of the violence. Often they would have little warning before native warriors descended on their farms, homesteads, or traveling wagons. Attacks could happen at any time, day or night, and they were brutal. Some children were taken captive, while others were forced to witness the violence before being allowed to escape with their lives. For women, capture during these raids could lead to a terrifying future. Many were taken and forced into captivity, where they faced brutal treatment. For the men, the question was often whether they could fight back or escape with their lives. Native American raiders, skilled in surprise tactics, would strike swiftly, pillaging homes, taking livestock, and often killing settlers who put up resistance. Settlers were frequently haunted by the loss of family members, the destruction of their homes, and the uncertainty of their future. The emotional scars left by these experiences were often long-lasting, affecting the mental health of survivors. For years, these raids were often not just about acquiring supplies. They were about asserting control over the land that had been taken from the tribes and sending a message to the settlers that they were not welcome. The settlers were viewed not just as invaders, but as people who were willing to destroy everything Native Americans had lived for. As settlers continued to push westward, the conflict would grow more intense, leading to more raids and battles over territory. The violence that erupted during these raids was often necessary in the eyes of the tribes to protect their homes, families, and traditions. Fleeing into the wilderness after a raid was no small feat. The terrain of the Wild West was often hard. Mountains and dense forests could make travel slow and perilous. There were no well-maintained roads, and navigating in the wilderness required knowledge of the landscape and the ability to find food, water, and shelter in hostile environments, and the ever-present danger that their hopes for a better future could be destroyed in an instant. The stories of escape, sacrifice, and bravery were passed down through generations, shaping the legacy of the Wild West. In reality, both sides were engaged in a bitter struggle, with settlers often finding themselves on the wrong side of a land war, hunting for food, finding clean water sources, and avoiding dangerous wildlife became an everyday challenge. In some cases, settlers would find refuge in remote areas, hiding out in caves or makeshift shelters until it was safe to return to more populated areas. But this lifestyle was always fraught with danger. The forced removal of native tribes from their lands, most notably through the Indian Removal Act, and the establishment of the Trail of Tears, was seen by many Native Americans as a violation of their rights, an attack on their culture, and a fight for their survival. In their eyes, these raids were a desperate attempt to reclaim their homeland and stop the encroachment of settlers. A settler on the run had to be constantly vigilant, watching for any sign of pursuit by native warriors or hostile groups who had crossed their path. One of the greatest dangers settlers faced in the Wild West was the threat of Native American raids. The forced displacement of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands, combined with the encroachment of settlers, led to violent clashes and a series of brutal conflicts. For the settlers, Life on the frontier meant the constant threat of being attacked, whether by small bands or large groups of native warriors who sought to defend their land, homes, and way of life. Most homesteaders were not equipped for a prolonged defense, so when the raids began, the primary goal was escape. A settler who was lucky enough to survive a raid might have only moments to gather whatever they could carry before fleeing into the wild, seeking refuge in neighboring towns or settlements, or even trying to find their way back to safety through the hostile wilderness. The settlers' view of these raids was often shaped by their own fears and the rhetoric of expansion. The raid, sudden and deadly for the settlers. A raid was a terrifying, life-altering event. The settlers' response to these attacks was often hasty and desperate. In many cases, families were separated during these raids, surviving the wilderness. The runaway settler's dilemma. For those who managed to escape, survival meant living on the run. For the settlers, the ability to endure meant relying on basic survival skills. Moreover, the psychological toll of living in such fear was often worse than the physical hardship. The impact of the raids on Native American life. While settlers were the victims of these raids, it's essential to understand the reasons behind Native American resistance. The Native American tribes did not view their attacks as random violence. They were fighting for their right to exist and for their way of life. The clash of cultures was brutal, and while the settlers believed they had a right to the land, the Native Americans had been living on those very same lands for centuries. The threat of Native American raids was a constant reminder for settlers that the Wild West was not just about finding land or wealth. It was about survival in a place where danger and violence could come from both the land itself and the people who had lived there long before the settlers arrived. For those living in constant fear of raids, life was defined by uncertainty, survival. As the settlers continued to carve out their lives in the Wild West, they quickly realized that living on the run wasn't just a one-time occurrence during a raid. It became a recurring nightmare. Native American tribes, in their efforts to reclaim their land and protect their families, became increasingly resourceful and strategic in their raids. Each attack was part of a much larger struggle, a fight for survival, culture, and a way of life that was rapidly being destroyed by the arrival of settlers and their relentless expansion. The constant tension in the Wild West led to a sense of paranoia and unease, especially for the settlers living in more isolated areas. For these settlers, every sound in the night could be the beginning of a raid. However, these places didn't always offer the safety settlers hoped for. This constant movement was the price settlers had to pay for being free from the threat of violent reprisals. But living this way often led to exhaustion mentally, physically, and emotionally. The constant threat of violence and the uncertainty of life in the Wild West led to deep emotional scars. Settlers were haunted by the possibility of future raids, and many lived their lives in a state of constant alertness, never truly able to relax or feel safe. This paranoia could break families apart, as parents were forever worried about the safety of their children. Nightmares, stress, and anxiety became a part of everyday life, as survivors couldn't help. For Native American tribes, these attacks weren't just retaliation or revenge. They were part of a long-standing war to protect their way of life. For the settlers, it was a battle to control the land, to expand the frontier, and to build something of their own. But for the Native Americans, it was about survival, fighting to retain their identity and land in the face of overwhelming odds. The settlers had displaced them from their ancestral lands, and the violence was a last-ditch effort to reclaim their homes and their freedom. The settlers who survived these raids often carried the scars of their encounters into their future lives. For settlers, the frontier became both a place of opportunity and a land of peril, where the cost of survival often meant sacrificing everything they held dear. The threat of Native American raids was a constant reminder that the Wild West was still a land at war, and the fight for survival was far from over. Whether they eventually found peace or became more entrenched in the conflicts, their experiences were indelible, marked by grief, loss, and the long-lasting effects of living in constant danger, but relived their experiences every time a new storm or sound echoed in the distance. The endurance required to survive in this hostile territory left its marks on the survivors. The survivors of these raids often felt the weight of loss. The loss of family, property, and hope. Military forts, though established to protect settlers, were often poorly staffed and poorly equipped to handle the frequent raid. Some forts were abandoned after being overrun or starved out. And even in the most fortified towns, there was always a sense of vulnerability. Even those who didn't live in the most dangerous frontier areas still knew that they could be at risk of an attack, especially during the war seasons, when tribes were more active in their campaigns against the settlers. Many grew up too quickly, forced to confront death and loss, before they had a chance to experience the innocence of childhood. Post-traumatic stress became a widespread issue, but there was no language or understanding of it at the time. The bravery of settlers was often matched by their deep emotional scars, which they carried for the rest of their lives. Desperate measures, escaping and seeking refuge. The trauma from being attacked left many with a deep disillusionment with the frontier life. Some settlers, especially after losing family members or entire homesteads, chose to leave the Wild West altogether. They sought to return to the more settled and safer parts of the country, but for many, that journey was not possible. Their entire lives were wrapped up in the struggle to survive on the frontier. And leaving meant losing their only connection to the land they had fought so hard to claim. Indigenous raiders, often skilled in tracking, would pursue their targets for days, relying on their knowledge of the land to hunt down those who had managed to escape. Settlers, even if they fled into the wilderness, still had to face the harsh elements of the land weather. That meant snowstorms, extreme heat, or lack of food and water. The wilderness could be just as dangerous as the raiders. When a raid occurred, survival became the only priority. Fleeing wasn't always as easy as running to the next town or hiding in the woods. Those who had enough warning might be able to gather supplies and get away before the raiders arrived, but in many cases, the raids were sudden. Homes could be burned, livestock stolen, and families torn apart in a matter of hours. For settlers who were caught off guard, their only hope was to escape into the wilderness, praying they wouldn't be found or killed before they could reach safety. Escape was no guarantee of survival. Those who made it out of the raids often sought refuge in nearby military forts or neighboring towns. For many, the only true refuge was isolation, living in hidden, remote cabins, or moving frequently to avoid detection. Life in constant fear. The psychological toll of survival. While the physical toll of escaping raids was immense, the psychological toll was perhaps even more devastating. The mental toll was particularly severe for children who lived in an environment where violence could erupt at any time. For those who survived the raids, there was always the question of whether they should stay or leave. Cultural divides and the reality of war. The raids were more than just conflict. They were the result of a deep cultural divide between the settlers and the native tribes, who had lived on the land for centuries. As settlers pushed further west, they encountered not only Native Americans, but also a hostile environment, one where the threat of violence was ever present. This cycle of violence and hostility shaped the future of the frontier. Living on the run wasn't just about fleeing from the violence. It was about surviving in a world where the very foundation of life was built on chaos, uncertainty, and fear. The constant fear of raids and the ongoing war for survival shaped not only the settlers' lives, but the narrative of the Wild West itself. The psychological scars left by these terrifying experiences weren't easily healed. The constant moving, the losses, and the devastating toll of living on the run were a part of the settlers' lives for years, affecting everything from their relationships to their understanding of home and community. For those brave enough to leave behind the remnants of their once promising lives, the outskirts of civilization offered a strange form of refuge. Unpredictability was the hallmark of life in the wilderness. You never knew when you'd be forced to run again, or if the distant sound of hooves was the prelude to another attack. living in isolated cabins or settlements, far from any established towns. Children who had witnessed the destruction of their homes and the loss of family members in these attacks grew up with the fear and paranoia had permeated their early lives. Families who were torn apart by these events struggled with resentment, grief, and the absence of loved ones. Their experiences were often silenced, as the trauma they endured was too painful to share. Many survivors had trouble feeling at home after surviving violent raids, no matter where they relocated. They were disconnected from their past and alienated by the present, unable to escape the memories that followed them, even into the isolated wilderness. The fear of another raid was never far from their mind. The displacement of tribes from their ancestral lands was often forced by the United States government through military action and treaties, many of which were dishonored. The violence on both sides, though tragic, was born out of a fundamental clash of civilizations. The idea of reclaiming land after losing everything was often impossible in itself had been tainted by the violence that had occurred on it. Many settlers found that, after surviving a raid, the only way to rebuild their lives was to leave the site of their losses behind and start anew in a more stable location. And this historical conflict still leaves a legacy of tension between settlers and indigenous peoples today. The lingering uncertainty meant that they lived in a perpetual state of vigilance, never knowing when the next raid might happen. Those who could afford to move left the Wild West entirely, heading back to more settled parts of the country. But for those who couldn't afford to leave, life continued on the edge, shaped by memories of the violence that had come before. For the women who managed to escape or survive captivity, the memories of captivity haunted them for the rest of their lives. The toll of living in hostile territory shaped every aspect of their lives, from their relationships to their sense of identity. These experiences, passed down through generations, became an integral part of the narrative of the Wild West, a history defined by survival, loss, and the constant fight for land and freedom. Some returned to their families, but others, broken by their ordeal, were unable to fully reintegrate into society, where the scars of their experiences were seen as too foreign to be understood. The brutality of the raids was only one aspect of a larger conflict between settlers and indigenous tribes. For many Native Americans, these raids were acts of defiance, not just against settlers, but against the broader destruction of their culture and way of life. The arrival of settlers was not only a physical threat to their land, but a cultural one. Raids were, in many ways, the only recourse left for tribes who were fighting to survive in a world that had been rapidly taken from them. Even the ones who managed to stay together were marked by the mistrust of the world around them, always aware that danger could strike at any moment. Even those who weren't directly impacted by the violence of raids were affected by the stories and memories shared by the survivors, hearing first-hand accounts of loss and survival. For some, it was about finding ways to move forward. Even when every step seemed fraught with danger, the survivors would form small groups, where everyone would rely on each other for support, not just physically, but emotionally as well. Life was about creating new connections after having been torn from their old ones by violence and loss. These survivors would attempt to rebuild their lives in places where they believed they would be safe from native raids, and perhaps also from the lawlessness of nearby boomtowns. But isolation also brought with it its own set of challenges: harsh weather, difficult terrain, and the constant need to rely on self-sufficiency for survival. Escaping into isolation, a harsh but necessary choice. For many survivors, the only way to escape the relentless cycle of raids and violence was to disappear, to retreat deeper into the wilderness. The settlers in these isolated locations still faced the dangers of wildlife, starvation, and disease. But the threat of native raids was perhaps the most real and constant. In these remote settings, survival often depended on an individual's ability to build their own community. Despite the trauma of the past, the long-lasting impact on families. For those who survived native raids, the emotional scars often shaped their families for generations. Parents who had lost their children in raids or had been forced to flee without knowing the fate of loved ones often became emotionally numb. their ability to connect with their children severely strained. The toll on women was particularly brutal. Many women were captured during raids, either to be enslaved or forced into marriage by the Native Americans. The trauma of these events often made it difficult for settlers to form normal relationships. The changing landscape, the settlers and Native American conflict. As the years passed and settlers continued to push westward, the Native American resistance became increasingly organized, especially in the face of mounting pressure from the expanding American government and military forces. While settlers had their own stories of loss and suffering, it is important to understand that the Native American tribes also suffered immense losses and pain, rebuilding life after the raids. For those settlers who managed to survive the raids, the rebuilding process was long and painful. However, even after rebuilding, settlers were never truly free from the fear of attack. The experiences of settlers who escaped native raids were marked by a constant struggle to survive in an environment where violence was a part of everyday life.